Inverted grief induction is the psychological manipulation of someone's empathy response by flipping sorrow into guilt, making them feel responsible for pain that isn't theirs to carry. Inverted grief induction. This technique works by taking an emotional wound, real or fabricated, and strategically placing it at the feet of another person. The manipulator doesn't beg for sympathy. Instead, they express quiet suffering, subtle disappointment, or deep sadness in a way that implies the other person caused it. It's not what they say directly. It's the sigh at the right moment, the silence when comfort is expected, the look that lasts a second too long. The victim starts to replay the situation in their mind, trying to figure out what they missed, what they did wrong, or how they became the villain in someone else's tragedy. And once guilt sets in, the dynamic changes. The one feeling guilty becomes eager to repair, to earn forgiveness, to ease the pain that never actually belonged to them. This is how the trap is set. The manipulator now holds quiet power, not through aggression, but through emotional gravity. They don't demand obedience. They extract it through suffering that feels contagious. The victim begins to walk on eggshells, overcompensate, agree more, ask less, retreat into themselves. This technique is devastating because it doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like pain, and decent people rush to ease pain. But when grief is inverted and weaponized, it doesn't seek healing. It seeks control. The more the victim tries to fix things, the more tangled they become in an emotional debt they never truly owed. Over time, they feel smaller, weaker, more unsure of their moral standing, and that's exactly where the manipulator wants them: guilty, obedient, and emotionally owned. Identity fragmentation cueing. Identity fragmentation cueing is the psychological act of subtly breaking a person's sense of self into conflicting parts, then triggering those fractures at will to destabilize their confidence, memory, or behavior. At its core, this manipulation works by planting small, conflicting cues that make someone question who they really are. A manipulator might praise one version of the person while quietly criticizing another. They'll say, "I love when you're calm like this. You're not like how you get around others." Or, "You're so responsible lately, unlike how you used to be." These phrases don't seem harmful at first, but they begin to split the self-image of the person hearing them, carving cracks between their traits, their past, and their actions. The victim starts to wonder which version is real. Are they the dependable one or the unstable one? Are they authentic when they're alone or only when being watched? These questions slowly erode identity cohesion, turning the internal world into a battlefield of contradictions. And that's the goal: to weaken the certainty a person has in themselves so they become easier to steer, easier to gaslight, easier to control. When someone's identity is fragmented, it only takes a few well-placed cues to push them into shame, insecurity, or confusion. A single sentence can unravel their confidence. A look of disappointment can activate guilt from a version of themselves they thought they'd outgrown. And a memory they were once proud of can suddenly feel fake when framed the wrong way. This creates a state of psychological vertigo where the victim can't trust their own instincts, history, or reactions. They look to the manipulator to tell them who they are, and that's the final fracture, the moment they outsource their identity in exchange for temporary certainty. Silence implantation. Silence implantation is the covert psychological technique of training someone to suppress their voice, desires, or opinions, not by force, but by associating their expression with tension, disapproval, or withdrawal. It starts subtly: a small frown when they speak, a delayed reply after they open up, a shift in energy when they ask for something. The manipulator doesn't argue, doesn't yell. Instead, they use silence like a weapon wrapped in velvet, soft enough to be denied, sharp enough to be felt. Over time, the victim begins to notice a pattern. Every time they speak their truth, even gently, the room changes. The warmth fades, the closeness dies. They learn unconsciously that silence is safer than honesty. Eventually, they begin censoring themselves, not because they were told to, but because they were trained to. They leave thoughts unsaid, emotions buried, questions unasked. They think they're being considerate or keeping the peace, but what's really happening is psychological silencing. Their voice becomes something they tiptoe around, afraid of making things worse, afraid of being abandoned, afraid of that cold pause they can't explain but always feel. The genius and cruelty of silence implantation is that it leaves no scars. There's no fight to point to, no rule that was broken. The manipulator can say, "I never told you to be quiet," and they'd be right, but they never had to. The silence did the talking. The discomfort did the teaching. The absence of affirmation became its own form of control. This is why so many victims of this tactic don't even know they've been manipulated. They just think they're too emotional, too needy, too much. They mistake repression for maturity, but really, their silence was implanted quietly, consistently, and completely by someone who knew how to disappear at the perfect moment. Reality looping. Reality looping is a dark psychological technique that traps a person in a mental maze, where every attempt to question, understand, or escape their situation only leads them deeper into confusion, self-doubt, and dependency. The manipulator doesn't lie outright. They bend reality just enough to make the truth feel unreliable. They say things like, "That's not what happened," or "You're remembering it wrong," or "You're overthinking again." And they say it often, calmly, confidently, with just enough emotional weight to make the victim hesitate. Over time, the target starts to mistrust their own memory, instincts, and feelings. They double-check everything. They apologize for things they didn't do. They start to narrate their reality through someone else's voice. But the loop doesn't stop there. When the victim begins to question the manipulator, they're met with denial, defensiveness, or blame. "Why are you always so dramatic?" "I never said that." "You always twist things." Each confrontation becomes another loop, because no matter where the victim turns, the story shifts, the facts rearrange, the floor beneath them moves, and so they circle back over and over, trying to find where things went wrong. Eventually, they stop trying. The loop becomes their home. They live in constant second-guessing, unsure of what's real or imagined, what's theirs or implanted. The manipulator becomes the anchor, the one person who seems sure of anything, and so the victim clings to them, not out of love, but out of desperation for something that feels stable, even if that something is the very thing spinning the loop. Reality looping isn't just confusion, it's control disguised as truth. It strips a person of their ability to trust their own mind, and when that trust is gone, obedience often follows. The victim stops resisting, not because they agree, but because they no longer believe they're capable of knowing what's real. Praise poisoning. Praise poisoning is the psychological act of wrapping control, insecurity, or manipulation inside compliments, so that what feels like validation slowly becomes a leash. It starts with admiration that feels too perfect. "You're so strong. I don't know how you put up with me." "You're nothing like those selfish people out there." "No one else could handle what I put you through." These aren't just compliments. They are traps disguised as flattery, because hidden in each line is a script, a role the victim is being assigned. They aren't just being praised for who they are. They're being conditioned to stay that way, quiet, forgiving, overwhelmed but smiling. The victim internalizes this praise, not realizing it's coded in expectation. Now, if they set a boundary, they're no longer patient. If they speak up, they're not understanding. If they leave, they're not loyal. The same words that once made them feel seen now shame them into staying silent. It's no longer about being appreciated. It's about avoiding the withdrawal of that praise. The genius of praise poisoning is that it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like love. It feels like someone finally sees your best parts, But what they're really doing is weaponizing those parts, holding your goodness hostage. If the victim starts to crack, show anger, or break the image, the manipulator reacts with disappointment, confusion, or subtle guilt. I just thought you were better than this. So the victim performs. They hold themselves to an impossible standard, not for self-worth, but to maintain the illusion that kept them praised. They begin to fear their own truth because stepping out of the pedestal means falling into blame, withdrawal, or rejection. And so, praise becomes pressure, compliments become chains, and the person being admired slowly forgets who they were before they were told who to be. Reverse guilt triggering. Reverse guilt triggering is the dark psychological technique of making someone feel guilty for not doing something wrong. It flips the emotional script, turning innocence into a burden and forcing the target to apologize, submit, or overcompensate, even when they've done nothing at all. At the heart of this trick is emotional inversion. Instead of accusing someone of direct harm, the manipulator expresses hurt, disappointment, or withdrawal in response to behavior that is actually normal, healthy, or even kind. The victim is left confused, anxious, and scrambling to make things right, despite having no logical reason to feel guilt. A person might say, "I just thought you'd care enough to stay longer," or "I guess I expected too much from you," after you set a boundary, said no, or simply made a choice for yourself. Suddenly, the focus isn't on your right to choose, but on the pain they claim your choice has caused. The mind reacts violently to this kind of accusation. Most people are wired to avoid guilt, to seek peace, to repair harm. But when reverse guilt is triggered, they're repairing a crime they didn't commit. And in doing so, they begin surrendering control, offering more than they should, and doubting their own judgment. Over time, this dynamic becomes a cage. The victim begins to preemptively adjust their actions to avoid this inverted guilt. They shrink, overextend, people please, and self-abandon just to avoid the emotional manipulation disguised as sadness or passive disappointment. The abuser doesn't have to raise their voice. They just have to sigh, look wounded, or pull away quietly. The most dangerous part is that it feels like empathy, but it's not empathy. It's emotional blackmail dressed as vulnerability, and it's one of the most effective tools for control ever conceived. Value dissonance framing. Value dissonance framing is the psychological manipulation of someone's moral compass by placing their values in direct conflict with each other, forcing impossible choices, breeding confusion, and gaining silent control. The manipulator doesn't attack your beliefs. They weaponize them. They use your own principles against you, turning loyalty into guilt, kindness into weakness, honesty into conflict. They say things like, "I thought you believed in second chances," or "I guess compassion only matters when it's convenient," or "If you really cared, you'd understand why I did it." And just like that, the values that once made someone feel strong now make them feel conflicted and ashamed. What makes this technique so dangerous is its precision. The manipulator knows what matters to the person they're targeting. They know what morals anchor them. Then they begin crafting situations, emotional landmines, where no action feels clean. If the victim stands up for themselves, they feel cruel. If they stay quiet, they feel complicit. If they leave, they feel like they're abandoning someone. If they stay, they feel like they're betraying themselves. This kind of mental warfare creates cognitive chaos. The person starts to second guess not just their choices, but their character. Am I really good? Am I really fair? Am I just selfish in disguise? The internal conflict makes them easier to influence because people stuck in self-doubt don't fight back. They try to fix, they try to prove, they try to be better. Over time, the manipulator doesn't have to control the person directly. The victim begins controlling themselves, twisting their values to fit impossible circumstances, and that's the trap. The more they try to live by their morals, the more manipulated they become. because someone else is choosing the battlefield and rigging every fight. Cognitive hallucination seeding. Cognitive hallucination seeding is the psychological trick of planting subtle, false details into someone's perception of reality until their own mind begins to fill in the rest. It's not about convincing someone of a lie. It's about making their brain believe it invented the lie itself. This trick doesn't use direct statements. It uses suggestion, implication, and silence. The manipulator might say, "Are you sure that's how it happened?" Or, "Funny, I thought she looked scared when you talked to her." These phrases don't accuse, they don't even lie outright, but they infect the target's mental timeline. They destabilize memory, perception, and certainty. A person who was confident in what they saw, did, or felt suddenly begins questioning themselves. They begin rehearsing alternate versions of reality. Their own brain begins hallucinating the possibilities. And once the seed is planted, the mind takes over. It fills in gaps, rewrites details, exaggerates doubts. This is where the hallucination becomes real. The person begins to feel like something was off, even though nothing was. They become unsure whether they caused harm, misunderstood someone, missed a sign, or behaved inappropriately. It's a silent war inside their own skull, and they don't even know who started it. This trick is terrifying because the victim starts gaslighting themselves. They no longer trust their senses. They double-check every memory. They start asking others to confirm things they once knew for certain. Over time, their identity erodes, their confidence disintegrates. They become dependent on the manipulator for reality itself. It doesn't take much, just a whisper of doubt in the right moment. That's how you make someone hallucinate betrayal, guilt, or danger that never existed. And once they do, you don't need to control them. Their own mind will do the job for you. Trust withdrawal conditioning. Trust withdrawal conditioning is the psychological act of offering deep emotional safety, only to subtly remove it when the target shows autonomy, disagreement, or boundaries. It creates a dependency on approval by training someone to fear emotional disconnection as punishment. It begins with warmth. The manipulator builds a sanctuary of trust, affection, loyalty, listening, encouragement. They make the other person feel truly seen, often for the first time. This connection feels rare, intoxicating, but then, without warning, it disappears. Not completely, just enough to be noticed. A shift in tone, a cold silence, a change in the way the manipulator responds. It's not a confrontation, it's absence, and that absence speaks louder than any insult. The victim senses something is wrong. They replay the last conversation. Was it when they spoke up, when they hesitated, when they asked for space? The manipulator doesn't confirm or deny, just lets the other person squirm in uncertainty. The message becomes clear. The safety you felt is conditional. It can vanish if you step out of line. And so, the conditioning begins. The target starts adjusting. They silence discomfort. They agree to things they once questioned. They stop asking for too much. They begin performing the version of themselves that keeps the connection intact, not because they're weak, but because the loss of trust feels unbearable. It's emotional starvation after a feast. Over time, the manipulator doesn't need to withdraw anymore. The threat is enough. The victim polices their own emotions, scared of being met with coldness. They live in quiet fear of making the wrong move, because when trust is weaponized, love becomes a trap. Every act of independence risks abandonment, and so the manipulator doesn't just control the relationship, they control who the victim believes they're allowed to be. Emotional drain. Echoing is the psychological trick of reflecting someone's pain, stress, or vulnerability back to them in a way that amplifies their emotional exhaustion instead of easing it. It mimics empathy on the surface, but beneath it multiplies fatigue, disorientation, and emotional collapse. This tactic is used by people who pretend to care while strategically draining energy. Instead of offering support, comfort, or clarity. They echo the intensity of someone's suffering, but with just enough distortion to make the person feel worse. If someone says, "I've been feeling overwhelmed," the manipulator responds with, "Yeah, it's like everything's falling apart for everyone, isn't it?" Instead of helping anchor the other person, they drown with them, intentionally. They reflect despair, fear, and chaos, not to connect, but to deepen the pit. The genius of this trick is that it feels like sharing. It looks like empathy, but it offers no clarity, no space, no relief. It suffocates slowly, and the target, already depleted, begins to associate conversation with fatigue. They start censoring their emotions around the manipulator, not because they're hiding, but because it costs too much. The emotional toll becomes unbearable. Over time, this dynamic becomes a subtle form of domination. The manipulator trains the victim to avoid expressing needs or distress, because every time they do, the weight gets heavier, the emotions darker, the silence more deafening. And so the victim begins carrying everything alone, not because they want to, but because they've been taught. Vulnerability leads to more pain. Emotional drain echoing is a weapon disguised as presence. It offers no solution, only reflection, and that reflection slowly poisons the soul. The more a person opens up, the more they drown in their own feelings, echoed back louder, heavier, and more hopeless than before. Intimacy collapse technique. The intimacy collapse technique is the dark psychological strategy of rushing deep emotional closeness, only to suddenly withdraw it, creating emotional whiplash that makes the target addicted to reconnecting with the bond that was abruptly taken away. It begins like a dream. The manipulator mirrors your thoughts, your pain, your past. They ask the right questions, make the right jokes, and reflect your deepest values back to you like a soulmate in disguise. The intimacy feels immediate, like you've known them forever. Vulnerability flows easily. Secrets are shared quickly. Emotional walls fall. And it doesn't feel rushed. It feels destined. But then, just as suddenly as it began, it stops. The messages slow. The warmth fades. The emotional connection, the very thing that made you feel alive, vanishes. You wonder what changed. Was it something you said? Were you too much? Did they lose interest? The manipulator offers no clear answers, only mixed signals. One moment they're cold, the next they throw you a spark of the old warmth, just enough to keep hope alive. This is the collapse, not of the intimacy itself, but of your internal balance. You were opened up completely, then left to spin in the void that followed. The human mind doesn't handle this well. It craves closure, explanation, consistency. So the victim begins chasing the high of that early connection. They text more, try harder, give more of themselves, hoping to earn back the closeness that once felt so real. But it was never real. It was engineered to create dependence. The manipulator knows that once someone feels deep connection, the loss of it hurts like withdrawal. It creates emotional hunger, self-doubt, and obsession. And that's the goal. Not love, but control through absence. Because when intimacy is used as bait, the victim isn't falling in love. They're falling into a cycle, one where the manipulator decides when connection lives and when it dies. Perception anchoring. Perception anchoring is the psychological trick of subtly controlling how someone sees everything that follows by carefully manipulating the first impression they form. It doesn't force belief, it frames it, and once that frame is set, the human brain will twist reality to fit inside it. The trick begins with an anchor, a vivid, emotional, or biased piece of information placed at the beginning of an interaction, decision, or conversation. It might be a quiet warning like, "She can be really dramatic sometimes," or a casual compliment like, "He's the smartest guy I know." These small statements feel harmless, but they become mental weights. They warp every future detail through the lens of what was said first. And it works because the brain is lazy. Once anchored, the mind stops seeing clearly. It starts comparing instead. If someone is told, "This guy is a genius," they're more likely to overlook his mistakes and exaggerate his intelligence. If someone is told, "She's unstable," they'll interpret confidence as arrogance and emotion as proof of instability. The anchor becomes the filter. Everything else bends to fit. What makes perception anchoring so dark is how invisible it is. The manipulator never has to argue. They just plant the anchor, step back, and let time do the distortion. The target thinks they're being objective, but they're not. They're stuck inside a lens they never chose, one that was quietly handed to them before they even started looking. And once that frame hardens, it's nearly impossible to break. New evidence gets dismissed. Doubts feel like betrayal. The person doesn't realize they're being controlled because the control came before the decision. They aren't reacting to truth. They're reacting to the anchor. And that single shift can change how they see a person, a memory, a choice, or their entire life. Invisible comparison trap. The invisible comparison trap is a covert, psychological manipulation where someone is silently measured against an undefined, idealized standard, causing them to feel inadequate, anxious, and forever not enough without ever knowing who or what they're competing with. It doesn't start with criticism. It starts with subtle praise, just not for you. The manipulator might casually mention how some people just handle stress better, or my ex never made a big deal out of things, or I really admire people who just know how to stay calm. No name, no direct accusation, just a shadow cast over the moment, a reminder that someone else, somewhere, is doing it better, and the target begins to shrink. Because they don't know who they're being compared to, they can't fight it. There's no clear rival, no defined flaw, only the sinking feeling that they've fallen short. The silence becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, the victim starts adjusting themselves. They become more agreeable, more restrained, more self-correcting, not because they were asked to, but because they were measured and found lacking. This tactic creates a permanent state of emotional tension. The victim starts to feel like they're never quite enough, always missing some invisible mark. Every compliment they receive feels conditional. Every mistake feels like confirmation. They don't just want to be loved, they want to be better than whoever the manipulator might be silently holding up. The genius of the invisible comparison trap is that it makes the target compete against a ghost. There's no one to confront, no exact words to point to, just a lingering sense that someone else, somewhere, is easier to love. And when people feel like they're being subtly outshined, they don't rebel. They work harder to please. They beg for approval, and slowly they disappear into someone else's standard. Delayed validation addiction. Delayed validation addiction is the psychological trick of making someone crave approval by withholding it just long enough to create emotional dependency. It's not about praise, it's about the timing of praise, and when done right, it doesn't just control what someone feels, it controls when they feel allowed to feel good about themselves. This tactic works by giving small, unpredictable doses of validation, praise, affection, attention, only after the person has exhausted themselves trying to earn it. The manipulator might stay distant, cold, or unimpressed for days or weeks. Then, just when the target is on the edge of emotional depletion, they drop a single compliment. "You actually did pretty well this time," or "That's what I've been waiting for." It feels like a breakthrough, but it's not. It's bait, and the brain chases it. Because the mind is wired for patterns, this inconsistency becomes addictive. The person begins tying their self-worth to the hope of being noticed. They work harder, become more obedient, sacrifice boundaries, and overextend emotionally just to receive that next hit of delayed approval. And when it finally comes, it feels like love. It feels earned, but really, it was engineered. This creates a toxic emotional economy. The target becomes less motivated by truth or passion and more by the manipulator's unpredictable reactions. Their sense of value begins to decay. They stop trusting their own instincts. They need to see themselves through the other person's eyes, and those eyes only open when they've been broken down enough. What's horrifying is that once someone gets hooked on delayed validation, they will defend the abuser. They will justify the waiting, romanticize the struggle, and even call it growth, because in their mind, the moment the praise arrives, it feels like healing, even though it was the cause of the wound all along. Microapology Confusion. Microapology confusion is a psychological tactic where a manipulator delivers frequent, shallow apologies, not to take accountability, but to blur blame, reset tension, and maintain control through emotional disorientation. At first, the apologies seem sincere. Sorry if that came off wrong. Sorry you feel that way. I didn't mean it like that. Sorry. But they're never direct, never complete, never anchored in real ownership. Instead of I was wrong, the apology becomes a performance, an emotional fog that mutes the victim's anger while keeping the manipulator in control. The genius of the micro-apology is that it halts confrontation without ever resolving it. The moment someone begins to speak up or name a boundary, the manipulator drops a soft, vague sorry into the conversation, and suddenly the mood shifts. The victim feels guilty for pushing further. They second-guess whether their feelings are valid. After all, they got an apology, didn't they? But something still feels off. That's the confusion. The brain searches for closure, but there is none. The apology didn't include change, acknowledgement, or a shift in behavior. It only served to neutralize the moment and buy more emotional space. And because the manipulator apologizes often, just enough to seem reflective, the victim begins to question themselves instead. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe they really didn't mean it. Maybe I'm overreacting. Over time, this creates a cycle where the victim suppresses pain in exchange for shallow peace. They stop bringing things up. They lose track of what was real and what was already apologized for. And the manipulator never has to change because every wound is blurred by a soft, strategic sorry. Not too loud to feel manipulative, not deep enough to be real, just enough to reset the game and keep playing. Hope collapse maneuver. The hope collapse maneuver is a dark psychological trick that weaponizes optimism by feeding someone just enough hope to make them emotionally invest, only to rip it away at the precise moment it matters most. It's not about denying hope outright. It's about building it up like a promise, then destroying it like a punishment. This manipulation starts with a glimmer, an opening, a shift, a signal that things might finally get better. A cold person suddenly acts warm. A cruel boss offers a compliment. An emotionally distant partner starts planning a future. The victim begins to relax. They breathe for the first time in weeks. They believe maybe, just maybe, they were wrong about everything, that maybe the pain had a purpose, that maybe the person really cared all along. And then, right at the emotional peak, the rug is pulled, the warmth vanishes, the plans are canceled, the silence returns, the kindness evaporates, and it wasn't just the loss that breaks them. It was the timing of the loss, because now they don't just feel hurt, they feel foolish for hoping, ashamed for believing, exposed for wanting. This trick works because the human spirit is built on hope. People can endure almost anything if they believe it's leading somewhere. Manipulators know this, and they exploit it. By offering temporary hope, they don't just gain control, they reset the emotional baseline. The victim will try harder next time, they'll wait longer, they'll forgive faster, all because they once tasted what they thought was change. Over time, the hope collapse maneuver creates a psychological scar. The person begins to mistrust joy. They brace themselves during happiness. They self-sabotage before anything good can arrive, because part of them is still waiting for the fall. And that fear, that hesitation, that constant flinching at love, praise, or peace, that's the maneuver still working. long after the damage is done. Shame reversal projection. Shame reversal projection is a dark psychological tactic where a manipulator takes the guilt or shame they should feel and silently transfers it onto the person they've hurt, making them carry the emotional weight of the abuser's own behavior. It doesn't happen through shouting or rage. It happens through subtle twists in logic, emotional reactions that don't fit the facts, and a masterful ability to play the wounded. Imagine confronting someone who clearly crossed a line, lied, betrayed, or neglected you. Instead of acknowledging it, they go quiet, sigh, look disappointed, or say something like, "I can't believe you'd think I'd ever do that to you." Suddenly, you're not the hurt one. You're the attacker. You're the one who went too far. You're the reason they're now upset. This flips the emotional power dynamic in an instant. The victim begins to backtrack, trying to explain, clarify, soften their tone. They might even apologize for bringing it up, and the person who should be carrying the burden of shame now watches as their target carries it instead. This reversal is deliberate, even if it appears passive. The manipulator has made themselves the victim in their own wrongdoing. They don't fight the accusation. They dissolve it by becoming the one who is hurt by it. Over time, the true victim begins to fear bringing up anything that might create tension. They associate confrontation with guilt, emotional distance, or being labeled unfair or cruel. They become emotionally conditioned to protect the person who harmed them, to carry the shame that was never theirs, to bury their truth for the sake of peace. And that's the trap. Shame isn't erased, it's outsourced. And the person who should have learned, changed, or atoned walks away lighter, while their victim walks away wondering why it still feels like their fault. Anticipation withholding is the psychological trick of deliberately creating excitement, desire, or emotional buildup in someone, only to deny the climax or delay the payoff until their need becomes obsession. It is the slow strangling of fulfillment, not by refusal, but by postponement. And that waiting, that hunger, that gnawing emotional ache, that's exactly the point. This tactic plays with the brain's reward circuitry. When a person is promised something, attention, praise, closure, intimacy, their mind begins to anticipate it. That anticipation releases dopamine. It sharpens focus, deepens emotional investment, and intensifies longing. But when the reward never comes or keeps getting pushed just out of reach, it creates emotional torment masked as patience. The manipulator may hint at a conversation that never happens, dangle an opportunity that never arrives, or promise emotional vulnerability they never deliver. "Let's talk later. I'll explain soon. I just need time." These phrases aren't lies. They're tools used to keep the other person emotionally suspended, always reaching, always waiting. And in that waiting, identity begins to bend. The victim stops asking for what they need. They start adjusting their entire emotional rhythm to someone else's clock. They begin to chase silence, decode mixed signals, and crave even scraps of attention, because at least that means something is coming, but it never does. And that's what makes anticipation withholding so devastating. The person begins to feel that the lack of resolution is their fault. They try harder, give more, hold on tighter. Meanwhile, the manipulator controls the tempo of the relationship, not with actions, but with absence. This kind of control doesn't scream, it doesn't slam doors. It whispers, vanishes, delays, and watches as the other person collapses into pieces of themselves, still clinging to the hope that maybe, next time, the promise will finally be kept. Hyperspecific gaslighting. Hyperspecific gaslighting is a refined form of psychological manipulation where the abuser doesn't deny the whole truth, only the smallest, most precise details, causing the victim to question not just their memory, but their entire perception of reality. Unlike traditional gaslighting, which often involves broad denials like, "that never happened," This method is razor sharp. The manipulator agrees with the general story, but denies exact moments, specific words, or the exact tone that was used. Yes, I said that, but not in that tone. Or, sure, we had the conversation, but it was on Tuesday, not Wednesday. These corrections seem small, insignificant, almost reasonable, but that's exactly why they're so devastating. Because when someone is told they're wrong about the tiniest part of an experience, they begin to doubt the entire event. Memory is fragile. When even one detail is challenged confidently, the brain starts to reconstruct everything around it. The victim begins to wonder, if I was wrong about the day, was I wrong about what they said? If I exaggerated the tone, did I also exaggerate the meaning? That self-doubt compounds, and slowly they start handing over control of the truth to the person who questions it most convincingly. Hyperspecific gaslighting is especially dangerous because it feels smart, calm, factual. It doesn't look like abuse. It looks like someone being reasonable while you get emotional. It's a tactic that leaves no obvious trace, just a subtle erosion of confidence, clarity, and self-trust. The victim over time becomes terrified of their own memory. They hesitate before speaking, second guess before defending, and begin to seek the manipulator's version of reality as the more stable one. Not because it's true, but because theirs has been chipped away, one microscopic correction at a time. Emotional thread cutting. Emotional thread cutting is the psychological trick of abruptly severing the invisible bonds that make someone feel seen, valued, or emotionally safe right after they've opened up. It's the silent, surgical destruction of trust, and it leaves the victim emotionally dangling, questioning not just the relationship, but their own worth. This tactic preys on the natural vulnerability that comes with emotional sharing. The manipulator listens just enough to make the other person feel safe. They may ask intimate questions, maintain eye contact, nod with soft concern, all signs that say, "You can trust me." But once the deepest emotions are laid bare, grief, shame, trauma, joy, that's when the blade drops. A dismissive comment, a change of subject, a cold stare, a mocking laugh, or worse, complete silence. The sudden shift is shocking. It creates an emotional whiplash the brain can't process. The person who felt held now feels discarded. And it's not just rejection. They feel exposed. They regret being open. They retrace every word. They wonder if they're too much, too dramatic, too broken. The manipulator doesn't have to say anything cruel. They just have to disappear at the moment connection was needed most. Over time, emotional thread cutting trains the victim to self-censor, to never go too deep, to never feel too much, to keep their inner world locked behind a door no one can touch. Not because they want to, but because they learned what happens when they try. They fear the silence that follows vulnerability more than they fear loneliness itself. And that's the real damage. The person stops trusting connection. They smile instead of speak. They nod instead of cry. And inside, they carry invisible wounds, cut not by insults, but by the quiet abandonment that followed the moment they were finally real. Altruism as weapon. Altruism as weapon is the psychological manipulation of kindness, where acts of generosity, support, or selflessness are used not to help, but to control, obligate, or shame the target into compliance. The manipulator doesn't yell. They give. They sacrifice. They show up at the perfect time with help, comfort, or solutions. But there's a quiet price stitched into every favor. It's not spoken, it's felt. After everything I've done for you, I dropped everything to be there. I always put you first. These phrases sound noble, even humble, but the moment you set a boundary, say no, or express discomfort, the generosity is thrown back like a dagger dressed in grace. That's the weapon, guilt disguised as love. The victim starts to feel like they owe something. They don't want to seem ungrateful. They don't want to hurt someone who has only ever been kind. so they stay quiet, they accommodate, they repay invisible debts, they bend themselves into a version that won't offend the person who gave so much. But deep down, they feel trapped in a contract they never agreed to, one where every act of independence feels like betrayal. This tactic is especially cruel because it uses virtue as a leash. The manipulator gets to wear the mask of a martyr while pulling the strings behind the curtain. They create a reality where kindness becomes coercion and saying no feels like a sin. Over time, the victim begins to equate love with debt, help with guilt, and support with submission. They don't feel free, they feel watched, judged, bound by invisible strings of generosity. And worst of all, when they finally try to speak out, they're met with disbelief. But they've been so good to you, because no one sees the cage when it's made of flowers. Microframing contagion. Microframing contagion is the psychological trick of subtly infecting someone's worldview through tiny, repeated shifts in how things are described, until their entire perception of reality bends without them noticing. It doesn't rely on lies, it relies on language distortion, repeated often enough that the victim starts seeing the world through a lens they didn't choose. This tactic works like a slow drip of poison. The manipulator doesn't argue, demand, or attack. Instead, they reframe neutral or positive events with slight twists in tone, phrasing, or emphasis. You trust people too quickly becomes you're too naive. She's ambitious becomes she's desperate for attention. That opportunity sounds exciting becomes sounds risky. Honestly, none of it sounds aggressive, but the emotional framing is warped, and that warp spreads. Over time, the target absorbs the new frame without resistance because it's never direct. It slides under the radar of critical thinking, and that's the genius of microframing. It feels like conversation, not control, but soon the person starts echoing the language. They begin doubting safe people. They hesitate before celebrating joy. They become suspicious, guarded, cynical, without remembering when that shift began. It's contagious because it spreads not just from manipulator to target, but from target to world. Once infected with a distorted frame, the victim unconsciously spreads it to others through tone, hesitation, or subtle disapproval. It becomes the air they breathe. They don't realize their optimism has been replaced by suspicion, their confidence by paranoia, and worst of all, they often think these new beliefs are their own. Microframing contagion doesn't shout. It whispers, it infects through casual comments, repeated tones, and sly emotional slants until the victim sees reality not as it is, but as the manipulator wants it to be. And by the time they notice, they're already speaking the virus out loud. Feedback deprivation technique. The feedback deprivation technique is a subtle, psychological strategy where a person withholds emotional responses, approval, validation, praise, or even criticism to create anxiety, self-doubt, and obsessive overperformance in the target. At first, it feels like confusion. You put in effort, say something meaningful, open up, or do something kind, and there's no reaction, no acknowledgement, no warmth, just a blank stare, a slow nod, a change of subject. The manipulator doesn't argue, they starve. They starve you of response, leaving you to fill the silence with questions. Did I do something wrong? Was it not good enough? Should I try harder next time? You start to chase a reaction that never comes. This is the trick. Most people are psychologically wired to seek feedback. We crave it to understand where we stand, socially, emotionally, relationally. When that feedback is missing, the mind spirals into uncertainty. And uncertainty is a powerful form of control. The manipulator doesn't need to criticize you. They simply make you feel invisible, and that absence begins to burn. Victims of this technique often begin over-explaining, over-correcting, overcompensating. They try harder to please, to impress, to earn some kind of signal that they matter. But the more they give, the quieter the manipulator becomes. The emotional starvation deepens the obsession. It doesn't just make the victim feel unsure, it makes them desperate for any form of reaction, even negative. At least then, they'd know they exist. Over time, the manipulator becomes the judge of worth. Their silence decides what has value, and the victim, once confident, becomes a shell, constantly adapting, anxiously scanning, never quite secure, all because someone learned how to punish, not with cruelty, but with the cold absence of feedback. Sudden distance injection. Sudden distance injection is the psychological trick of abruptly pulling away from someone emotionally, mentally, or physically right after a moment of closeness, causing confusion, insecurity, and a deep need to reestablish the lost connection. It's not a breakup, it's a shockwave, and it's designed to destabilize. This tactic works because the human nervous system responds to connection like safety. When someone opens up, shares laughter, feels warmth, or experiences intimacy, their brain releases oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin. These chemicals say, "You're safe here, you're wanted." But when that connection is suddenly ripped away, without warning, explanation, or closure, the mind enters panic. It searches for what went wrong, what was said, what needs to be fixed. And in that panic, control shifts. The manipulator doesn't explain the silence. They don't reply as quickly. Their eyes grow colder. They stop laughing at jokes. Or worse, they act completely normal, just colder. That contrast is what destroys. The person who once felt seen now feels invisible. The emotional high becomes emotional withdrawal, and the victim blames themselves for it. This creates an addiction to restoration. The target begins chasing the connection they briefly had, bending over backwards to bring it back. They become more agreeable, more apologetic, more desperate. And with every effort they make, the manipulator regains power, not by giving affection, but by controlling its absence. Sudden distance injection is often used in toxic relationships, narcissistic abuse, and trauma bonds. It trains the victim to associate love with fear, safety with instability, and closeness with dread. The brain starts bracing for distance the moment it feels connection, and that fracture becomes permanent. A part of them never fully trusts intimacy again, not even when it's real, because the warmth now carries the shadow of the next cold wave. Affection withheld punishment. Affection withheld punishment is a psychological control tactic where love, warmth, and intimacy are strategically withdrawn, not out of emotional truth, but as a consequence for behavior the manipulator wants to suppress. It's not a loud rejection, it's quiet, calculated. One day they're affectionate, engaged, present. The next day you feel them pull away, not physically, but emotionally. The eye contact fades, the laughter disappears, the texts get shorter, the touch becomes less frequent. You try to reach for them, but they subtly recoil, and they don't explain why. That's what makes it work. They just act disappointed, tired, or preoccupied. You're left to guess what you did wrong. This creates a dangerous loop. The victim begins rewinding every conversation, every tone, every choice. They start internalizing the belief that love is conditional. If they speak too much, too little, if they disagree, express needs, or simply act outside the manipulator's comfort, they risk emotional coldness. Affection is no longer a sign of love. It becomes a reward, something to be earned, something to not mess up. Eventually, the person on the receiving end becomes hyper-aware of their behavior. They shrink their voice, they hide their irritation. They learn which version of themselves is lovable and which version makes the room go cold. And they start choosing emotional safety over authenticity. That's the point. Affection becomes currency. The manipulator knows that the threat of emotional distance is more effective than any argument, because when someone has tasted real closeness, the sudden absence of it hurts like rejection. And when that absence is tied to punishment, the victim doesn't just feel unloved, they feel unworthy. so they comply, not because they want to, but because silence from someone who once held you close can feel like suffocating without ever raising their voice. Personal narrative hijack. Personal narrative hijack is the psychological trick of slowly rewriting someone's life story in real time, subtly replacing their own memories, meanings, and beliefs with someone else's version. It doesn't require force, it requires suggestion. And once it begins, the victim starts forgetting who they are and starts becoming who the manipulator says they are. This technique works by intercepting key moments in a person's self-understanding, memories of strength, choices of independence, or experiences of pain. The manipulator doesn't outright deny these things. They reinterpret them. You weren't being brave, you were being reckless. That wasn't abuse, you just misunderstood. You've always needed someone to guide you. These aren't statements of truth, they're injections designed to override identity. At first, the target resists, but over time, with repetition, emotional pressure, and isolation, they begin questioning their own perspective. They start rewriting past events through the manipulator's lens. Suddenly, moments of courage feel like mistakes. Boundaries they once felt proud of feel selfish, and parts of their story that once gave them strength now feel shameful. The more the narrative is hijacked, the weaker the original identity becomes. The person stops defending themselves, not out of submission, but because they genuinely start to forget what was real. They adopt the language of their abuser. They explain their trauma using someone else's script. They apologize for who they were before the hijack even started. And the cruel genius of this trick is that the victim will often thank the manipulator because it feels like clarity, like guidance, like truth, but in reality, they've been severed from the deepest parts of themselves until their voice is no longer their own, and all that remains is a life story, ghost-written by someone who never loved them, only wanted to own them. Subjective reality sabotage. Subjective reality sabotage is the psychological tactic of dismantling someone's trust in their own perceptions, not by outright denial, but by subtly rewriting their experiences until nothing they feel, see, or remember feels solid anymore. It begins quietly. You describe how something made you feel, and they respond, "That's not what happened," or "You're being too sensitive." You mention a pattern you've noticed, and they call it coincidence. You recall a moment of tension, and they claim it wasn't that serious. They aren't fighting your story head on. They're slowly editing it, word by word, tone by tone, until you start wondering if you ever understood it at all. The sabotage doesn't happen through conflict. It happens through calm, confident redirection. They paint your instincts as flawed, your memories as overblown, your interpretations as emotional or exaggerated. And because it's done so subtly, so rationally, you begin to doubt yourself long before you doubt them. You find yourself second-guessing feelings that once felt clear. You hesitate to share your thoughts, fearing you might be wrong again. You start asking others, replaying events, journaling, trying to pin down the truth like smoke in your hands. And yet, it keeps slipping, because every time you rebuild a version of reality that makes sense, they gently knock a piece out of place. Over time, this erosion becomes identity-threatening. You no longer trust your gut. You don't know what actually happened. And in moments of fear or clarity, you even start wondering if you're the problem. That's the true danger, when the manipulator no longer needs to lie. They've trained your mind to do it for them. Subjective reality sabotage turns truth into a puzzle with no edge pieces. It traps you in a world where every feeling is questioned, every thought reframed, and every version of your own story ends with a question mark instead of a period. Subtle success, undermining subtle success. Undermining is the psychological trick of downplaying, deflecting, or twisting someone's achievements, just enough to chip away at their confidence without triggering open conflict. It's not about outright sabotage. It's about corroding pride from the inside, until success feels hollow, undeserved, or even shameful. This tactic thrives in close relationships where praise should be safe: family, partners, friends, even colleagues. When someone shares good news, "I got promoted," "My project went viral," "I finally finished the book," the underminer doesn't attack directly. Instead, they inject microdarts masked as casual remarks. "Wow, that's great. Must have been lucky timing." Or, "I didn't think that kind of thing even mattered to you." Or, "Just wait until the real pressure starts." These aren't insults. They're infections. Each one introduces doubt. The person begins wondering, was it really that big of a deal? Did I deserve it? Am I being arrogant for celebrating this? And slowly, pride turns to self-questioning. Motivation turns to overcompensation. Joy turns into a need for external permission to feel good. What makes this tactic so dark is its subtlety. The manipulator gets to wear the mask of support while draining the energy behind every accomplishment. They rarely say anything outright wrong, but they never fully celebrate. They never mirror the enthusiasm, their silence, their tone, their word choice. It all pulls the achievement back down to earth, just enough to dull its shine. And over time, the victim becomes allergic to their own success. They downplay their wins. They apologize for their growth. They share less, dream smaller, and wait for others to validate what they once felt proud of. Because somewhere along the line they were taught, your light is too bright, and now they dim themselves automatically before someone else does it for them. Sleepwake guilt framing. Sleepwake guilt framing is the psychological manipulation of a person's natural rhythms, using their patterns of rest, fatigue, and daily energy cycles to subtly instill guilt, laziness, shame, or emotional inferiority for simply being human. It doesn't sound cruel. It sounds productive. You're still in bed? Must be nice to sleep in. Some of us are already on our third task today. These aren't direct attacks. They're casual, passing remarks that land like little cuts. The target may have needed rest. Maybe they were recovering or working late or just existing. But suddenly, rest becomes something to apologize for. They feel slow, weak, behind. Even when their body was right, their mind starts to panic, and it doesn't end when the day begins. Sleep-wake guilt extends into the entire rhythm of how someone operates. If they aren't early risers, they're lazy. If they slow down at night, they're wasting time. If they take naps, they're avoiding responsibility. The manipulator ties productivity, virtue, and even love to a schedule that fits their own expectations, using time itself as a moral weapon. The victim begins to rewire their habits not to suit their well-being, but to earn back invisible approval. Rest becomes earned, never granted. Sleep becomes shame. Over time, this tactic doesn't just affect a routine, it poisons identity. The person begins to feel like a failure before they've even had breakfast. They wake with anxiety. They overcompensate through burnout. They try to deserve peace. And when they do rest, it feels stolen. This is how the manipulation works. It's not about sleep. It's about control over energy, rhythm, self-trust. And when someone feels wrong for simply existing in their own body's timing, they become easier to manage, easier to exhaust, and easier to command. Because exhaustion doesn't just break the body, it quiets the will. Jealousy, phantom planting. Jealousy. Phantom planting is the psychological trick of creating the illusion that someone else is a threat, not by accusing, but by subtly implying, until the victim becomes paranoid, insecure, and emotionally volatile without understanding why. It's not about infidelity or betrayal, it's about instability through imagination. This tactic doesn't require lies, only whispers, pauses, and well-placed glances. The manipulator might casually drop a name into conversation. "Oh, I ran into Maya today. She looked really good." Or leave a phone notification visible just long enough to spark a question. They might laugh a little too hard at someone else's joke in front of their partner, or compare them to someone else under the guise of a compliment. You're way more grounded than Jenna ever was. Each of these moments is surgical. They don't provoke direct accusations. They provoke insecurity. The victim begins replaying words, analyzing gestures, wondering about past relationships, future ones, and phantom rivals that might not even exist. It eats at their peace, not with truth, but with possibility. They start asking questions they never asked before. They scroll through social media differently. They dress more carefully, speak more sweetly, try harder, because a shadow has been planted where there once was trust. And the genius of this trick is that it makes the victim feel like the jealous one. They begin to hate their own reactions. They apologize for being crazy. They feel guilty for asking questions. And eventually, they stop expressing discomfort altogether because the manipulator keeps looking calm, honest, unbothered. Over time, the victim begins battling an invisible enemy, not a person, but a possibility. They don't know what's real anymore. All they know is that something feels off, something feels threatened, and they are slowly unraveling while the manipulator stands back, innocent, watching them fall apart over a war they never declared. Emotional reward inversion. Emotional reward inversion is the psychological tactic of reversing the natural emotional consequences of behavior so that healthy actions are met with punishment and self-sacrificing or harmful ones are met with affection, praise, or closeness. This technique rewires a person's emotional compass. When they speak up for themselves, set a boundary, or express a need, they're met with coldness, criticism, or withdrawal. But when they stay quiet, tolerate mistreatment, overextend, or abandon their own needs, the manipulator showers them with affection. Suddenly, love feels safest when the self is gone. The trap is invisible at first. The victim doesn't notice the pattern until their nervous system does. Every time they try to be honest or strong, their body feels punished through emotional distance, tension, or guilt. But when they self-abandon, something strange happens. The room gets warmer, the silence breaks, the tension softens, the love returns. And that's the inversion. The natural consequences of empowerment are reversed. Speaking truth no longer brings connection, it brings pain. And surrendering your needs no longer brings loneliness, it brings comfort. The emotional logic of the relationship is flipped upside down until the victim starts to equate self-erasure with safety. Over time, they stop reaching for what's good for them because they've been taught it hurts. They chase only what makes the relationship feel stable, even if it kills their spirit. The manipulator doesn't need to say a word. Their reactions train the other person like a machine, punishing authenticity, rewarding obedience. This is how emotional reward inversion works. It hijacks the feedback loop of love. And once the person believes that betraying themselves is the only way to be held, they'll keep handing themselves over, piece by piece, just to feel close to the one who taught them pain feels like love. Denial bombing. Denial bombing is the psychological trick of overwhelming someone with a rapid, repeated flood of denials, so aggressive, so confident, and so emotionally intense that it makes the truth itself collapse under pressure. It's not just denying something, it's detonating disbelief into the mind of the person trying to hold on to reality. This tactic works by brute forcing confusion into the victim's nervous system. If someone confronts a manipulator with evidence, "You said that, you did this, I saw it happen," the manipulator doesn't explain, justify, or defend. They go on the offensive. "That never happened. I never said that. You're making it up. You always do this. What's wrong with you?" The denials come fast, loud, and unrelenting, leaving the victim no time to process. The human brain, under emotional shock, starts to short-circuit, especially when the person delivering the denials seems so sure. The victim starts second-guessing what they know. They begin to wonder if they're misremembering, exaggerating, or being irrational. The sheer force of the denials feels more real than the memory itself. What makes denial bombing so devastating is that it bypasses logic. It attacks the foundation of perception. When done repeatedly, it creates a split in the victim's sense of reality. They know what they felt, but they're told those feelings are fake. They know what they saw, but they're told their eyes lied. And eventually, they stop trusting themselves at all. This is not just gaslighting, it's psychological blitzkrieg. The goal isn't to persuade, it's to disorient, to erase reality through emotional overload. And when the dust settles, the victim often apologizes, not because they were wrong, but because they were broken by a storm of denial that made certainty feel like madness and truth feel like a weapon turned against them. Self-doubt echoloop. The self-doubt echoloop is a psychological sabotage tactic where a manipulator repeatedly reflects uncertainty back onto the target until doubt becomes a mental reflex and confidence dies in the echo of their own second-guessing. It starts with the smallest interruptions. Are you sure? That's not how I remember it. I just think you might be misreading things. These phrases don't sound cruel. In fact, they sound concerned, protective even, but they plant tiny seeds of uncertainty, and the more often they're dropped, the more the target begins to hesitate before speaking, acting, or deciding. Eventually, the victim internalizes the voice of the manipulator. They begin to preempt it. Before making a choice, they wonder, what if I'm wrong? What if I misremembered? What if I overreact? The doubting no longer needs to be triggered from the outside. It echoes from within. And the worst part? They think it's their voice now. They don't realize it was installed. The echo grows louder over time. Every attempt to trust themselves is followed by mental noise. They rehearse conversations before having them, apologize in advance, check and recheck their memory, their feelings, their tone. Confidence becomes arrogance in their mind. Certainty becomes a liability. They start asking for permission to exist. This loop is a slow suffocation because it doesn't kill certainty all at once. It just delays it until it dies on its own. The victim becomes stuck in perpetual rehearsal mode, terrified of being wrong, desperate for validation, exhausted from thinking in circles. And the manipulator? They don't even have to say much anymore. The loop does the work for them. They built the cage, and now the mind itself is locking the door over and over again, echoing with questions that never end. Warmth, withdrawal, spiral. Warmth, withdrawal, spiral is the psychological trick of flooding someone with affection, attention, and emotional closeness, then slowly, silently pulling it away until the absence becomes a form of punishment the victim blames themselves for. It's not about being cold, it's about making warmth feel conditional, unpredictable, and addictive. At first, the manipulator is all light. They mirror emotions, give compliments, initiate deep conversations, respond quickly, and offer intense presence. The victim feels chosen, seen, safe. Their nervous system opens up like a flower in sunlight. And just when they start to depend on that emotional climate, the warmth begins to fade. But it doesn't vanish all at once. That would be too obvious. Instead, the changes are subtle. Texts get shorter. Eye contact weakens. Laughs come less often. Responses are delayed. Affection becomes rare. But there's no fight, no explanation, just a slow, suffocating chill. And in that cold, the victim begins searching for the cause. They replay conversations, apologize for imagined offenses, and try to earn the warmth back by being nicer, quieter, more agreeable. And that's exactly how control is established. The manipulator turns love into a game of performance. Be exactly who I want, or I withdraw. Over time, the victim stops asking for emotional needs to be met. They become afraid to disrupt anything. They fear that even mild expression might trigger more distance. So, they silence themselves. and with every step they take to keep the warmth alive, they lose a little more of their own internal fire. The spiral deepens when the manipulator occasionally turns the warmth back on, just enough to reignite hope, a sweet message, a kind gesture, a sudden hug. It feels like rescue, but it's actually the reset button on the spiral, and down they go again, confusing inconsistency with love and coldness with something they must have caused. Belonging interruption. Belonging interruption is a covert psychological tactic where a manipulator destabilizes a person's sense of connection, inclusion, or community, just enough to make them feel like an outsider in spaces where they once felt safe. It doesn't take much. A joke that doesn't land, a group conversation where the victim is spoken over, a subtle shift in tone when they walk into the room. The manipulator might say, "Everyone was wondering where you were," or "We already talked about that," or "You wouldn't get it." These comments are light on the surface, but they cut deeply, not by what they say, but by what they imply. You're late, you're different, you're not quite one of us. This tactic targets a primal human need, the need to belong. When that need is threatened, people don't rebel. They adapt, they shrink themselves, they try harder to fit. The victim might laugh at things they don't find funny, nod when they disagree, offer help where it's not needed, just to feel included again. But the sense of disconnection lingers. It doesn't scream, it hums, and the manipulator controls the volume. They decide when the victim feels included and when they don't. One day they're warm, pulling them close. The next day, cold, distant, making them doubt their place. Over time, this unpredictability rewires the victim's behavior. They become hyper-attuned to social cues, desperate for approval, terrified of exile. They don't feel part of something. They feel temporarily tolerated. That's the power of belonging interruption. It doesn't push people away. It makes them hold on tighter, not to the connection itself, but to the hope of it. Because when someone feels like they're always almost enough, almost accepted, almost safe, they'll keep contorting themselves for a seat at a table that was never built for them to rest at. Desire overlap, exploitation. Desire overlap, exploitation is the psychological trick of identifying the one thing someone deeply wants, and then mirroring it just enough to create the illusion of perfect alignment, only to use that overlap as a leash. It's not about giving someone what they want, it's about pretending to want it too until they mistake manipulation for connection. This tactic begins with careful listening. The manipulator doesn't dominate early conversations. They extract. They learn what excites the other person, the dream, the value, the future they crave. It could be emotional intimacy, success, security, adventure, or belonging. Once identified, the manipulator echoes it. That's exactly what I've always wanted too. I feel the same way. We're so alike. The words feel serendipitous, soulmate-like, fated, and that's when the hook goes in. The victim opens up. They project compatibility. They invest. They start imagining a shared life path. But slowly, the overlap begins to shift. The manipulator nudges the shared desire in their direction. If we really believe in this, shouldn't we move faster? If this is what we both want, then why aren't you trying harder? They use the shared dream to demand compliance. The genius of this trick is that it doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like alignment. The victim doesn't realize they're being pushed. They think they're compromising for love, for destiny, for purpose. And when things feel off, they blame themselves. Am I not ready? Am I sabotaging this? Am I the problem? Eventually, the shared dream becomes a tool of emotional control. The manipulator gives just enough of it to keep the illusion alive, while quietly steering everything toward their benefit. And the victim stays, sacrifices, and submits, because leaving would feel like betraying not just a person, but the very dream they thought they finally found. Reputation seeding. Tactics. Reputation seeding tactics are a form of social manipulation where a person strategically plants subtle, believable comments or stories about someone, designed not to destroy their image outright, but to slowly corrode how others perceive them. It never looks like a smear campaign. It looks like casual concern, light-hearted jokes, or passing remarks. The manipulator might say, I love her, but she can be a little intense sometimes, or he's brilliant though a bit unpredictable, or they mean well but you know how emotional they get. These comments don't accuse, they suggest, and suggestion is far more powerful than accusation because it lets the listener draw their own conclusions while the manipulator stays clean. This is how social narratives are planted, not with force, but with seeds, small enough to be ignored, but sticky enough to grow. When repeated to different people in different ways, the same idea begins to echo through the social environment. Suddenly, others start noticing what they've been primed to notice. The victim's passion becomes too much. Their confidence becomes arrogance. Their silence becomes coldness. And no one questions where this framing came from because it feels like it emerged organically. Meanwhile, the victim has no idea. They just start noticing subtle shifts in how people respond. Fewer invitations, less eye contact, a sense of distance they can't explain. And when they finally hear the whisper, it's already too late. The room has been colored, their name has been framed, and the people around them have absorbed a story without realizing they were ever told one. That's the brilliance of reputation seeding. It doesn't destroy in one blow, it erodes in whispers. It makes the target socially radioactive without ever appearing cruel, and by the time the victim realizes their reputation is no longer theirs, the manipulator is already 3 steps away, watching from a safe distance while everyone else does the isolating for them. Hypervulnerability Extraction. Hypervulnerability extraction is the psychological trick of getting someone to reveal their deepest wounds, secrets, and traumas at a rapid pace, not to understand them, but to weaponize them later. It's intimacy as surveillance, compassion as camouflage, and once the information is extracted, it doesn't vanish, it waits. This tactic begins with false safety. The manipulator creates a rush of emotional closeness, often within hours or days of meeting. They might say, "You can tell me anything," or "I've never felt this connected so fast." They may even share a manufactured trauma of their own to set the tone, something raw enough to feel real, but vague enough to stay untraceable. The victim, caught in the glow of intense connection, feels safe to open up, and so they do. They talk about childhood, betrayal, guilt, abandonment. They confess the parts of themselves they rarely show, the shame, the self-doubt, the hidden scars. And while they're speaking, the manipulator listens with focused eyes, soft nods, perfect timing. It feels like being heard. It feels like love. But what's actually happening is data collection, intimate intel disguised as emotional bonding. The danger doesn't show up immediately. It comes later, when the relationship shifts, when control is needed, or when the victim resists. That's when the wounds are replayed like a threat. "Isn't this just like when your dad left? You're doing that thing again. You always said you hated that about yourself." Don't act like the victim. You said you used to manipulate people too. Suddenly, the things that were shared in trust are no longer sacred. They're tools, and the victim, realizing their vulnerability has been turned against them, often goes silent, not out of strength, but out of shame, because now even their pain belongs to someone else, and that sense of emotional violation can be deeper than any lie ever told. Cognitive dissonance trap. The cognitive dissonance trap is a psychological manipulation technique that forces someone to hold 2 opposing truths, one they see and one they're told, until the mental tension drives them to surrender their judgment, not for clarity, but for relief. It begins with contradictions. A manipulator might hurt you and then insist they love you. They'll lie and then say they've always been honest. They'll neglect you and frame it as giving you space. Your body reacts, confused, tense, on edge. But when you question the mismatch, they double down with conviction. You're just misunderstanding me. Why would I do that if I didn't care? You always assume the worst. Now you're trapped. Your mind can't hold both realities without fracturing something. If you believe them, you must ignore your instincts. If you believe yourself, you must accept that someone you trust is manipulating you. Both choices hurt. So the brain does what it's wired to do in dissonance. It seeks the path of least resistance, and most people choose to believe the version that brings temporary emotional safety, even if it costs them truth. That's the brilliance and cruelty of the trap. The manipulator doesn't need to be consistent. They only need to be convincing. And the more confusing the contradiction, the more tightly the victim clings to the illusion that maybe they're wrong. They begin rewriting memories to match the narrative. They suppress uncomfortable emotions. They defend the very behavior that wounds them, because if they didn't, everything would break. Over time, the victim becomes emotionally numb. Their inner compass spins. They no longer trust what they feel, see, or sense. All they know is they can't hold both versions anymore, so they discard their own. And in that moment, the manipulator wins, not by overpowering, but by making the truth too painful to hold. Empathy weaponization. Empathy weaponization is the psychological trick of using someone's compassion as a tool of control by turning their kindness, patience, and understanding against them. It's not about evoking empathy. It's about exploiting it, bending it into a leash that keeps the victim quiet, compliant, and emotionally trapped. This tactic begins when the manipulator identifies a target with a soft heart, someone who gives benefit of the doubt, who listens deeply, who sees the good in others even when it hurts. Then the manipulator starts misbehaving, lying, withdrawing, lashing out, or breaking promises. But when confronted, they don't deny it. They break down. They explain. They cry. They share a sob story. I'm just really struggling right now. You know I didn't mean it. It's just because of what I went through as a kid. Suddenly, the roles reverse. The victim, who had every right to set boundaries, now feels guilty for even bringing it up. Their anger dissolves into pity. Their strength melts into sympathy. They say, "It's okay," when it's not. They forgive too soon. They accept too much, because their empathy makes them feel cruel for defending themselves. Over time, this dynamic trains the victim to suppress their needs, to walk on eggshells, to absorb harm without reaction. Every time they try to protect themselves, the manipulator turns into the wounded one, and the more hurt the victim gets, the more they feel responsible for the pain of the person hurting them. The horror of empathy weaponization is that it makes goodness feel dangerous. The very trait that once connected the victim to others becomes the reason they stay in toxic patterns, and slowly they learn that love must always come with suffering, and that standing up for themselves means abandoning someone who needs them, even if that someone is the one tearing them apart. Regret programming. Regret programming is a psychological manipulation tactic where a person is conditioned to associate their independent choices with pain, guilt, or imagined loss. So they begin avoiding self-directed action, not because it's wrong, but because they've been taught it will haunt them later. It starts with a pattern. The manipulator doesn't forbid action. They just attach it to future suffering. You'll regret saying that someday. I hope you don't look back and realize you ruined something good. I just don't want you to make a mistake you'll never recover from. These statements sound like concern, but they don't offer guidance. They offer a ghost, a shadow of future pain that the victim starts fearing long before anything has actually gone wrong. The target begins to hesitate. They delay decisions. They suppress instincts. They reroute their choices through the question, "What if I regret this?" And in that hesitation, the manipulator gains power, because every moment the victim stalls, second guesses, or panics, they return to the person who planted the fear in the first place, for reassurance, for permission, for control disguised as comfort. The genius of regret programming is that it requires no actual punishment. The punishment is imagined, internalized, self-inflicted. The manipulator simply builds a future that the victim learns to dread, then frames every act of self-assertion as the first step toward that imagined disaster. And when something does go wrong, no matter how small, the trap snaps shut. See, I told you this would happen. The person isn't just hurt. They're humiliated by their own disobedience. And next time, they stay quiet. They comply, not because they're weak, but because they've been programmed to see their will as dangerous and someone else's voice as their only shield from regret. Accidental intimacy engineering. Accidental intimacy engineering is the psychological trick of orchestrating emotionally intense moments that feel organic and unplanned, so the other person believes a deep, authentic bond has formed by fate, not manipulation. It's the illusion of chemistry crafted through calculated chaos. This tactic starts with engineering situations that mimic vulnerability, urgency, or emotional openness. The manipulator might accidentally reveal something personal in conversation, let their voice crack at just the right time, or create a moment of shared secrecy, like "I've never told anyone this before." These events are framed as spontaneous, but they are deliberate cues designed to signal emotional safety and connection. Other times, it's circumstantial intensity that's manufactured, a late-night call after a rough day, a walk that turns into a heart-to-heart under the stars, a sudden confession of fear or childhood pain. The environment is staged to feel raw, fragile, and intimate, even though none of it is truly unplanned. The victim interprets the emotional exposure as rare and real, and they respond by opening up in return. And that's when the trap closes. The connection feels unique, special, faded, like two souls colliding in perfect timing. But in truth, the manipulator simply understands one fact: humans bond quickly under emotional pressure. Accelerated vulnerability feels like love, especially when it's mutual. But here, it isn't mutual. It's manufactured. Over time, the victim becomes emotionally tethered, believing they've found a rare connection. They overlook red flags, justify inconsistencies, and idealize the manipulator because they think they've seen the real version of them. But what they saw wasn't reality. It was a performance, one crafted not to connect, but to capture. Victimhood, superiority framing. Victimhood superiority framing is a dark psychological technique where a manipulator presents their own suffering as so unique, noble, or untouchable that it places them above accountability, turning pain into a pedestal and vulnerability into a form of dominance. It doesn't sound like power. It sounds like hurt. The manipulator speaks in stories of betrayal, abandonment, struggle. They cry easily. They reflect often. They say things like, "No one's been through what I have," or "You have no idea what it's like to live with this kind of pain." And slowly, the conversation shifts, not toward healing, but toward hierarchy, because their suffering isn't just something they've endured, it's something they now own. In this frame, the victim becomes the moral authority. Their pain gives them the right to interrupt, accuse, withdraw, control, and if you try to set a boundary or hold them accountable, they frame it as cruelty. How could you say that to someone like me? You're making this about you again. The power flips. The more they hurt you, the more compassion you're expected to show them. And if you dare bring up your own pain, it's minimized, dismissed, compared. At least you had a family. At least you didn't go through what I did. Your suffering isn't real. It's disrespectful. Because in their eyes, there's only room for one victim, and they already claimed it. Over time, this creates a suffocating dynamic. You become the emotional caretaker of someone who uses fragility as armor. You suppress your needs to avoid being seen as selfish. You validate endlessly, hoping one day they'll do the same, but they don't need to. They're too busy surviving, too busy winning the unspoken competition of who hurts more. And that's the cruelty of victimhood superiority. It turns empathy into a one-way street and uses pain not to connect, but to rule. Guilt echo seeding. Guilt echo seeding is the psychological trick of planting emotional landmines that replay in someone's mind long after the manipulator is gone, making the victim punish themselves in silence through looping thoughts of guilt, shame, and imagined wrongdoing. It's not about confrontation. It's about implanting self-doubt that echoes without end. This technique works by suggesting guilt rather than stating it. The manipulator might say, "I know you didn't mean to hurt me," or "It's okay, I'll be fine, like always." These words sound forgiving, but they drip with emotional charge. The tone, the timing, the sadness in their eyes, that's the delivery system. The target walks away thinking everything is fine, but something feels off, and that something begins to loop. Later, sometimes hours, sometimes days, the seed sprouts. The mind replays the moment. Was I too harsh? Did I say something wrong? Are they hurting because of me? The manipulator doesn't have to say anything else. The victim becomes their own accuser. They write the apologies. They rewrite history. They become haunted by what they might have done, even when they did nothing at all. Over time, guilt echo seeding breaks a person's emotional reflexes. They begin defaulting to guilt whenever conflict arises. They hesitate to speak up. They over-explain. They over-apologize. They become hypersensitive to emotional shifts, scanning others for signs of silent hurt they must have caused. The echo grows louder with every relationship. What makes this so insidious is that the manipulator never appears cruel. In fact, they appear sensitive, noble, even hurt, but they know exactly what they're doing, creating echoes that live inside the victim's mind like ghosts, whispering you should have done more, said less, been better. And eventually, the victim begins to believe that guilt is proof of love, and peace is something they no longer deserve. Ethical doubt injection. Ethical doubt injection is a psychological control tactic where the manipulator plants subtle questions about the morality of the victim's choices, not to inspire integrity, but to create hesitation, shame, and a chronic fear of being a bad person. It doesn't come as an accusation. It arrives as a suggestion, wrapped in softness, dipped in guilt. I'm surprised you're okay with that. I just wouldn't feel right doing something like that. That's your decision. I just hope you thought about the consequences. These words don't call you wrong. They make you wonder if you are, and in that wondering, the seed is planted. This tactic targets the conscience. It hijacks the part of the mind that wants to do good, be kind, act fairly, but instead of encouraging strength, it creates paralysis. The victim begins overanalyzing everything, how they speak, what they say, what they ask for, even how they take care of themselves. Every action becomes an ethical dilemma. Every boundary feels like a potential betrayal. They start sacrificing what's right for them to avoid being seen as wrong by someone else. The manipulator's genius lies in their plausible deniability. They never told the victim they were immoral. They merely raised the question, and because the victim is already wired to be empathetic or thoughtful, they take the bait every time. They become stuck in a loop of moral anxiety, forever apologizing, over-explaining, or walking on eggshells. Over time, the victim begins to outsource their ethics. They second-guess not just their decisions, but their character. Am I selfish? Am I cruel? Am I losing who I used to be? They begin to defer to the manipulator's silent judgment, reshaping themselves not around truth, but around fear. Because ethical doubt doesn't scream, it whispers, and those whispers, once internalized, become a leash, wrapped tightly around the kindest part of the person until their goodness becomes their prison. Obligation grafting. Obligation grafting is the psychological trick of quietly attaching unspoken duties, debts, or expectations onto acts of kindness. So the other person begins to confuse care with contract. It turns generosity into currency and affection into leverage. On the surface, it looks like giving, but underneath, it's the planting of a hook. This tactic starts with a favor, a gift, or an emotionally generous gesture. The manipulator might go out of their way to help, offer unsolicited support, or make sacrifices that seem thoughtful and pure. I stayed up all night helping you. I covered that cost for you. Don't worry about it. I didn't tell anyone what you said. These things appear selfless, but they come with hidden strings that are only revealed when it's time to collect. Later, when the victim tries to set a boundary, ask for space, or act independently, the debt is suddenly invoked. After everything I've done for you? Wow, this is how you repay me? I guess it was too much to expect the same loyalty. The kindness becomes currency, the emotional gift becomes a receipt, and the victim begins to feel like a criminal for simply wanting autonomy. What makes obligation grafting so toxic is that it rewrites the meaning of generosity. The victim starts questioning every kind act they receive. Was that real? Or will it come back later with a price tag? They begin overcompensating, giving more than they should, saying yes when they want to say no, apologizing when they're the one being manipulated, not because they owe anything, but because the manipulator made it feel like they do. Over time, the victim loses their ability to tell the difference between genuine care and covert control. Every hug has a hook. Every favor feels like a setup. And the terrifying part? They start grafting the guilt onto themselves, watering the roots of a debt they never agreed to owe. Subtle memory sabotage. Subtle memory sabotage is a psychological manipulation tactic where a person doesn't erase your memories. They bend them, just enough to make you doubt your recall, question your instincts, and eventually defer to their version of reality instead of your own. It doesn't start with denial, it starts with edits. That's not exactly how it went. I never said it like that. You're misremembering again. These corrections aren't explosive. They're gentle, persistent, and specific. The manipulator isn't trying to make you forget the past. They're trying to rewrite it, moment by moment, in their favor, not by shouting over your truth, but by subtly sanding it down, dulling its edges, and softening the parts that make them look bad. It's psychological erosion. You remember being hurt, but they remind you how sensitive you were at the time. You recall them disappearing, but they offer proof that they texted once. You confront a betrayal, and they say, "That's not how I remember it, but if it matters so much to you, I'm sorry." And now you're not just doubting what happened, you're doubting your right to be upset about it. Over time, you begin to adjust your own stories before you even speak them. You leave out details, you water things down, you anticipate correction. The moment a memory surfaces, a voice whispers, "Wait, did it really happen like that?" And soon, you begin to trust the person who sounds so certain, so calm, even if your body remembers something very different. This is how subtle memory sabotage works. It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be close enough to believable. Because when truth is bent, not broken, it becomes hard to hold. And when memory no longer feels safe, the victim stops arguing, not because they're wrong, but because they're too exhausted to hold a story no one else will validate. Social proof. Undermining social proof. Undermining is the psychological trick of quietly eroding someone's credibility and likability in the eyes of others, not by direct attack, but by planting subtle doubts that spread like smoke through a room. It's reputation sabotage disguised as concern, humor, or passive observation, and by the time the target feels the cold, they don't know where the draft came from. This tactic exploits a basic human instinct. We look to others to gauge value, trust, and belonging. The manipulator knows this, and begins the sabotage in whispers. They might say, "She means well, but sometimes she overreacts," or "He's smart, but you know how he gets when the pressure's on." These statements aren't insults, they're seeds designed to split perception just enough so people start watching differently. From that point on, confirmation bias takes over. If the target raises their voice, it's "there it is." If they miss a deadline, it's typical. If they make a bold move, it's too much. The crowd begins to shift, not because of something the target did, but because of a lens they never knew had been handed out behind their back. What makes social proof undermining so sinister is its invisibility. The manipulator appears neutral, even supportive. They aren't attacking. They're just being honest, just concerned, or just joking. Meanwhile, the target begins to notice people pulling away, second-guessing them, withholding trust, and worst of all, they start adjusting themselves to fix it without realizing the damage was engineered. This trick is often used by jealous colleagues, toxic friends, or insecure partners who fear being outshined. They don't want to destroy the target publicly. They want to weaken their echo, make their voice softer, their presence smaller, their power invisible, not by silencing them directly, but by changing the way others hear them. Phantom betrayal triggering. Phantom betrayal triggering is a psychological manipulation technique where a person fabricates or exaggerates feelings of betrayal, not because they've been hurt, but to make someone feel guilty, unsafe, and desperate to prove their loyalty to a wound that never really existed. It begins with a shift in tone, a sudden silence, a strange distance. The victim senses something is wrong, but doesn't know what. When they ask, the manipulator might say, "I just didn't expect you to act like that," or "I thought I mattered more," or the most toxic of all, "Never mind, it's not worth talking about." That's the trigger, the unspoken accusation that somehow, somewhere, the victim broke an invisible code. The betrayal isn't named because it doesn't need to be. It exists in suggestion. It thrives in ambiguity. The victim starts replaying their words, their tone, their timing, searching for the mistake. What did I say wrong? Did I forget something? Was I inconsiderate? The manipulator stays vague, and that's the genius of it, because what can't be seen can't be disproved. The victim begins to self-incriminate, apologizing not for actions, but for possibilities. And this is where control takes hold. Once the victim believes they've hurt someone, they become eager to repair it. They explain more, they offer more, they prove more, they overextend in an attempt to reclaim trust that was never actually lost. All the while, the manipulator watches the dynamic flip. They are now the wronged party, the one who deserves care, the one who can now set new expectations, quietly, without resistance. Phantom betrayal triggering doesn't manipulate facts. It manipulates feelings about facts. It makes someone feel disloyal for existing in their own truth. And the more the victim bends to fix the betrayal, the more they lose themselves to it until guilt becomes obedience and love becomes a test they never stop trying to pass. Unspoken rule enforcement. Unspoken rule enforcement is the psychological trick of creating invisible expectations that are never clearly stated, yet strictly punished when broken. It traps people in a game they never agreed to play, with rules they didn't know existed, and consequences that feel like emotional landmines. This tactic begins subtly. The manipulator establishes patterns, how often you should text, how much attention you should give, how to speak, what to avoid, what they expect, without ever saying a word. They smile when you follow these silent scripts and withdraw, punish, or guilt trip when you don't. The correction is felt, not heard. A cold shoulder, a shift in tone, a passive-aggressive remark. The air changes, and you're expected to know why. The genius of this trick is plausible deniability. If you confront them, they say, "I never said that," or "You're reading into things." And technically, they're right. They never said it, but you felt it, and now you live under its shadow. Over time, the victim becomes hyper-aware. They start scanning every action, every word, wondering what invisible rule they might break next. They walk on eggshells, apologize for things they didn't know were wrong, and over-explain decisions to avoid setting off emotional consequences. They begin to censor themselves, not out of respect, but out of fear of violating something they can't see. This trick conditions the victim into self-policing. They enforce the rules on themselves, often more harshly than the manipulator ever could. And the worst part? They start believing they're the problem, that their confusion, their hurt, their second-guessing means they're too sensitive or too difficult. But they're not. They're trapped in a structure of emotional control where silence is the weapon, and every unspoken rule is another chain wrapped around their sense of self, tightened by every punishment they never saw coming. Wordless disapproval technique. The wordless disapproval technique is a non-verbal psychological weapon where a manipulator expresses judgment, disappointment, or rejection without ever saying a single word, forcing the victim to absorb shame, adjust behavior, and chase approval through pure emotional guesswork. It's not what they say, it's the pause, the look, the shift in body language, a single raised eyebrow, a sigh, a glance at the phone mid-conversation, a cold stare when the victim laughs too loud or speaks too freely. No argument, no explanation, just energy, heavy, cold, pointed, and it lands harder than words ever could, because when disapproval is silent, it feels like truth, like something too obvious to even justify. The victim senses it instantly. Their stomach tightens, their tone changes, their shoulders drop. They start scanning. What did I do? Did I say too much? Did I overstep? The manipulator never confirms. They leave the tension hanging in the air like smoke, and the target breathes it in, choking on the possibility that they failed some invisible test. This technique creates an environment where the victim becomes emotionally self-policing. They begin adjusting themselves preemptively, laughing softer, talking less, second-guessing joy, hiding anger. They start walking on glass floors that were never announced. And worse, they begin craving validation from the same person who withholds it. Because silence can be louder than cruelty. And when affection is tied to the absence of disappointment, the victim doesn't chase love. They chase not being wrong. They live to avoid that pause, that sigh, that look. And slowly, they disappear beneath the surface of who they really are, just to keep the room warm. The manipulator doesn't need control through conflict. They get it through quiet judgment. Because once the victim fears the silence, they'll do anything to hear the coldness lift, even if it means becoming someone they no longer recognize. Future promise, withholding. Future promise, withholding is the psychological trick of dangling visions of an ideal future. Love, commitment, success, happiness, just close enough to keep someone invested, but never close enough to deliver. It's not about building a future together. It's about using the idea of one as emotional bait. This tactic begins with bright visions and powerful language. One day we'll move in together. I can really see us building something. When things calm down, everything will be different. These promises don't sound manipulative. They sound hopeful. They feel like intimacy, like direction, like a plan. And that's why they work. The victim believes they're walking towards something real, but time passes, and that future stays exactly where it was, in the future. The manipulator always has a reason why now isn't the right time. I just need to figure some things out first. We're so close. Let's just wait a bit longer. You're everything I want. I just need space right now. And so the victim waits, not because they're weak, but because they believe. They've been shown enough to keep believing. Over time, the person begins living not in reality, but in potential. They defend the manipulator to friends, justify the lack of progress, and tolerate the emotional limbo, because in their mind, They've already seen the ending. They just have to wait a little longer. And that's the genius of future promise withholding. It doesn't create pain. It delays resolution. It stretches the timeline just enough to exhaust hope without ever snapping it. The victim can't leave because they're so close. They can't demand more because they understand. So they stay, trapped in the illusion of a tomorrow that never comes, sacrificing the present in exchange for a fantasy forever just out of reach. Moral trap engineering. Moral trap engineering is a psychological manipulation tactic where a person designs no-win scenarios using the victim's own values, forcing them into emotional paralysis where any choice they make feels like a betrayal of their integrity. It begins with a setup. The manipulator frames a situation around a moral ideal they know the victim holds: kindness, loyalty, forgiveness, sacrifice. Then they create a scenario where only one path appears to protect that ideal, but it costs the victim their boundaries, voice, or truth. For example, if you really cared about me, you'd stay. Or, good people don't just walk away when things get hard. Or, so much for being understanding. The victim is presented with a false choice: protect themselves and be selfish, or surrender and remain good. This trap doesn't force, it entangles. The brilliance of the moral trap is that it makes the victim betray themselves in the name of being righteous. They stay in toxic dynamics to prove they're loving. They tolerate abuse to maintain loyalty. They give when they're empty because guilt whispers, it's the right thing to do. The manipulator never has to pressure them directly because the person's own identity becomes the weapon. Over time, the victim begins to resent themselves for the very qualities they used to be proud of. Kindness starts to feel like weakness. Forgiveness feels like failure. Their values, once sources of strength, become cages designed not to uplift, but to bind. They walk through life trying to be good, but always feeling like they're losing, because every act of protection feels like a betrayal, and every act of self-respect feels like a sin. That's the cruelty of moral trap engineering. It doesn't just control behavior. It rewires the soul to believe that being safe, honest, or free makes you wrong. And once that belief is planted, the manipulator never needs to push again. The conscience will do the work for them. Praise, critique, confusion loop. Praise, critique, confusion loop is the psychological trick of alternating between admiration and subtle criticism so unpredictably that the victim becomes emotionally disoriented, constantly chasing approval, terrified of disappointment, and unable to tell where they stand. It's not just mixed signals, it's emotional whiplash disguised as feedback. The tactic begins with praise, not just compliments, but deep validation. You're amazing. No one does it like you. I've never felt this way before. These moments hit hard. They open the heart. They build trust. The victim begins to feel safe, maybe even special. But then, often within the same breath, comes the twist. You're amazing when you're not being too sensitive. No one does it like you. But sometimes you really overthink things. I've never felt this way. But you need to work on your attitude. These critiques aren't direct enough to fight, but they're sharp enough to wound. They come wrapped in flattery, so the victim doesn't know whether to feel lifted or cut. They begin analyzing tone, reading between lines, apologizing for things they don't fully understand. Every conversation becomes a puzzle. Every silence feels like punishment. Every compliment feels like a setup for the fall. The genius of this loop is that it creates dependency. The victim starts living for the next wave of praise and working endlessly to avoid the next sting of criticism. But because the cycle is unpredictable, they can never truly win. They become addicted to harmony, allergic to conflict, and desperate to get it right next time. And that desperation rewires their self-worth. They stop asking, "Is this fair?" and start asking, "What did I do wrong?" And with each cycle, they hand over a little more power until even their confidence comes with conditions they didn't agree to. And love feels like a test. They're always on the verge of failing. Emotion overload. Timing emotion overload. Timing is a psychological manipulation tactic where the manipulator deliberately overwhelms the victim with intense emotions at carefully chosen moments so they can't think clearly, set boundaries, or process the truth. It isn't about rage or breakdowns. It's about when the emotional chaos is unleashed, right before a decision, right after a confrontation. In the middle of an argument, you were finally winning. Suddenly, the manipulator cries, yells, hyperventilates, or retreats into silence and despair. The air shifts. The logic dissolves. What was once a clear moment becomes a storm, and you are forced to drop your point to manage the weather. This is not loss of control. It is tactical chaos. The victim, who may have finally gathered the courage to speak up, set limits, or ask questions, is now emotionally disarmed. They're no longer in a position to finish their thought. They're in the role of comforter, mediator, or rescuer. The manipulator knows that flooding the moment with emotional noise will short-circuit rational thought. It creates urgency, guilt, and confusion, so the victim abandons their truth to restore calm. Over time, this technique conditions the victim to fear emotional reactions. They stop bringing things up, not because they don't care, but because they don't want to trigger another collapse. They choose peace over truth, calm over clarity, and that's the goal. Emotion overload timing makes confrontation impossible. It weaponizes vulnerability, performance, or crisis to freeze the victim's power at the exact moment it threatens to surface. And in the aftermath, once the storm clears, the manipulator never revisits the topic because they don't need to. The damage has already been done. The conversation is gone. The silence is back. And the victim, once again, is left holding the pieces of a truth that drowned before it could breathe. Perceived superiority injection. Perceived superiority injection is the psychological trick of subtly positioning oneself as wiser, more enlightened, or more evolved, not through open arrogance, but through gentle corrections, faint praise, and implied elevation, until the other person begins to diminish themselves without realizing it. It starts small, a tone shift, a raised eyebrow, a quiet, interesting take. The manipulator rarely attacks ideas directly. They refine them. They offer better versions. They say things like, "That's a good start," or "I used to think that too, until I grew out of it." The message is always clear. You're not wrong. You're just beneath me. This tactic works because it doesn't feel like criticism. It feels like mentorship, guidance, sophistication, and that's what makes it so dangerous, because the victim often admires the person doing it. They interpret condescension as intelligence. They begin deferring, agreeing, stepping back from their own voice to learn. But what they're really learning is how to submit. Over time, they stop sharing bold thoughts. They second-guess insights. They seek permission to feel smart. And in private, they rehearse conversations in their head, wondering how to sound more on their level. The manipulator doesn't have to dominate the room. They just have to radiate the illusion that they're already above it. Perceived superiority injection doesn't scream power. It whispers it. It plays the long game, training others to kneel slowly, voluntarily. And what's most twisted is that the victim often believes they've become better through this dynamic, when in truth, they've only become quieter, smaller, and more obedient to a hierarchy that was manufactured in silence. Microcontrol tethering. Microcontrol tethering is a psychological manipulation tactic where control isn't enforced through rules or threats, but through a constant stream of small, seemingly harmless preferences, corrections, and requests that slowly tether the victim's behavior to the manipulator's emotional comfort. It doesn't look like control, it looks like care. I just like when you text me before bed. That shirt's not really you, is it? It makes me feel better when you answer quickly. Each request is small. Each suggestion is easy to accommodate, but as they stack, they form invisible threads, one wrapped around how the victim dresses, another around how they speak, another around how they manage time, space, tone, and presence. None are serious enough to push back against, but together they constrict. The genius of microcontrol is plausible deniability. The manipulator can always say, "I never forced you." And they didn't, not once. They simply preferred, they gently steered, and the victim, wanting to please, adapted over and over again, until suddenly they're no longer acting freely. They're performing a version of themselves that won't disturb the balance. They stop doing what feels right and start doing what feels safe. This kind of control breeds hyper-awareness. The victim starts checking themselves before every action. Will this upset them? Will they pull away? Will I make them uncomfortable? It becomes easier to comply than to risk subtle disappointment. They live in a state of quiet tension, always calibrated, always adjusting. Over time, the victim forgets how it felt to simply be. They no longer trust their instincts because every instinct has been slowly reprogrammed by dozens of small corrections that didn't look like control but were. And the manipulator, they never had to raise their voice because when control comes in fragments, the leash is invisible, but it pulls just the same. Time scarcity engineering. Time scarcity engineering is the psychological trick of making someone believe that access, attention, or emotional availability is rare, precious, and easily lost. So they panic into compliance, rushing decisions, suppressing needs, and sacrificing boundaries just to keep the connection alive. It's not about being busy, it's about weaponizing urgency. This tactic begins with a sense of fleeting presence. The manipulator is inconsistent, here one moment, distant the next. They might say, "I don't know how much longer I can do this," or "I don't have time for drama," or simply disappear for hours, days, or emotional cycles, only to return with charm, intensity, or cold detachment. The rhythm isn't random, it's engineered. The victim starts to believe, this moment matters. If I don't act now, I'll lose everything. Over time, the person begins bending themselves into unnatural shapes to keep the connection warm. They rush to reply. They downplay concerns. They say yes when they want to say no. They give more, ask less, and shrink their needs into silence, all because they're terrified that if they speak too loudly or take too long, the manipulator might vanish again. And the cruel brilliance of this trick is that it flips emotional scarcity into a motivator. The victim stops asking, "Is this healthy?" and starts asking, "How do I keep them here?" They confuse inconsistency with high value. They equate emotional coldness with emotional sophistication, and soon they feel lucky to be noticed at all. Time scarcity engineering turns love into a deadline, intimacy into a ticking clock, and by the time the victim realizes they've been trained to beg for crumbs, they've already burned their own boundaries to meet someone in a room that was never meant to stay open. Unconscious conflict framing. Unconscious conflict framing is a psychological manipulation tactic where a person subtly places another in a position where every choice, reaction, or emotion is framed as evidence of inner conflict, causing the victim to doubt their motives, question their clarity, and second-guess their very sanity. It starts with a quiet challenge. The manipulator notices your passion and says, "You seem conflicted." They observe your firmness and say, "You're clearly overcompensating for something." You express calm, and they murmur, "You've become so detached." Every expression, no matter how composed or authentic, is framed as a symptom, a reaction, a mask covering a deeper issue that they claim to see, but you do not. The trap is disorienting because there's no specific accusation to refute, just a lingering sense that you're broken in a way you can't quite name. You feel like you must prove your piece, justify your decisions, explain your confidence until all of it starts to feel hollow. The more you try to clarify, the more they nod like a therapist unraveling a buried trauma, and you start to wonder, am I in denial? Is something wrong with me I can't see? That's the danger of unconscious conflict framing. It uses implication instead of accusation, and implication is far more destabilizing because it forces the victim to go inward and dig through their mind looking for rot that was never there. It creates a fog of introspection that disables action. You stop trusting your clarity because someone else has suggested again and again that even your certainty is a sign of chaos. And slowly, you begin outsourcing self-trust to the one who questioned it in the first place, not because they offered truth, but because they taught you to see conflict in your own calm and dysfunction in your own strength. And once that lens is installed, every mirror you look into starts to fracture. Invisible standard projection. Invisible standard projection is the psychological trick of silently expecting perfection, obedience, or hyper-awareness without ever clearly stating the rules, then expressing disappointment when those unspoken standards aren't met. It's not about setting expectations. It's about punishing someone for failing to read your mind. This tactic is cruel because it mimics morality. The manipulator never raises their voice. They sigh, they grow quiet, they look hurt, and when questioned, they respond with lines like, "I just thought you'd know," or "It's not something I should have to explain." The message? You failed not just to do the right thing, but to intuit the right thing. And in that moment, the victim doesn't just feel wrong, they feel defective. Over time, this conditioning erodes confidence. The target begins walking through life with invisible wires wrapped around their actions. They rehearse conversations in advance. They anticipate needs that haven't been voiced. They apologize just in case, because the fear isn't punishment, it's disappointment. That slow, chilling withdrawal of approval that says, you didn't measure up, and worse, you should have known better. And yet, the standard is always shifting. What was fine yesterday causes hurt today. What used to be praised is now barely acknowledged. The manipulator's expectations float like smoke, untouchable, always implied, never owned. If pressed to name the standard, they retreat behind vagueness. It's just common sense. Everyone knows that. You're being difficult. The result? A person who is constantly self-editing, hypervigilant, and ashamed of needs they can't even name. They feel inadequate, not because they're failing, but because they've been taught that understanding someone else's silence is the true test of worth. And the louder that silence grows, the more invisible they become inside their own life. Imposter syndrome activation. Imposter syndrome activation is a psychological manipulation tactic where a person deliberately amplifies another's hidden insecurities, subtly feeding the fear that their success, intelligence, or worth is fake, fragile, or undeserved. It begins with compliments that sting. I'm impressed they gave that role to someone so new. You're doing great for someone without formal training. You've really mastered the art of looking confident. These statements appear supportive, but they contain quiet landmines. They don't question what you've done. They question whether you earned it. And that is the trigger. The victim begins to doubt not just their accomplishments, but their entire identity. Every success feels like a fluke. Every compliment feels suspicious. Every mistake feels like exposure. They start looking over their shoulder emotionally, terrified that someone, somewhere, will finally say out loud what they secretly fear. You don't belong here. The manipulator doesn't need to push hard. A raised eyebrow during your presentation, a slow clap when you share good news, a reminder of how lucky you are. These are the invisible needles that slowly inflate the feeling of fraudulence. And the more the victim achieves, the more pressure they feel to defend their worth rather than celebrate it. Over time, this tactic erodes confidence from the inside out. The victim becomes addicted to perfection, terrified of visibility, desperate to prove what they never needed to question in the first place. And worse, they start shrinking, turning down opportunities, staying quiet in meetings, avoiding risk, not because they lack skill, but because someone taught them to see their strength as a mask. That's how imposter syndrome activation works, not by attacking your weakness, but by corrupting your brilliance. It doesn't tell you you're unworthy. It makes you whisper it to yourself, louder each time you rise. Micro-sabotage of joy. Micro-sabotage of joy is the psychological trick of subtly draining the life out of someone's happiness, not by attacking it outright, but by inserting tiny punctures into their moments of excitement, pride, or celebration until they begin to fear joy itself. It's not about making someone miserable, it's about making their joy feel unsafe. The manipulator doesn't yell or mock. They sigh, they delay responses, they respond to enthusiasm with cool indifference, or worse, sarcasm disguised as banter. You're really proud of that? Must be nice to have time for things like that. Don't get your hopes up too high. They might offer faint praise laced with quiet doubt. Good for you. I guess we'll see if it lasts. And it works because it feels small, harmless. The victim brushes it off the first few times, but their nervous system doesn't. The high they felt becomes a low they didn't expect. The laughter fades quicker, the heart sinks faster, and soon their body begins associating joy with deflation. They start preemptively dimming their own light before someone else does it for them. Over time, they share less. They celebrate privately. They hide wins, downplay passions, and stop talking about what excites them, not because the dream has died, but because it's no longer safe to be seen smiling. They fear the sting that follows it. The manipulator, meanwhile, maintains the illusion of normalcy. They never take joy away directly. They just make sure it never fully lands. They plant doubt in celebration, fatigue in excitement, distance in closeness, until happiness itself becomes confusing, heavy, dangerous, and eventually the victim stops pursuing joy, not because they don't want it, but because they've been taught in tiny, invisible ways that every time they touch it, it bleeds. Intellectual downplay mirror. The intellectual downplay mirror is a psychological manipulation tactic where a person subtly reflects a distorted image of someone's intelligence, minimizing their insights, ideas, or expertise through faint praise, casual dismissal, or performative misunderstanding until the target begins to question their own mental sharpness. It rarely sounds cruel, it sounds polite. You've got such a creative way of thinking, definitely not conventional. You always have such interesting perspectives, even if they're a little out there. You're smart in your own kind of way. These are not compliments. They are controlled reflections, mirrors warped just enough to cast doubt without creating direct offense. The manipulator reframes intellect not as a strength, but as a quirk, a novelty, a harmless eccentricity. The effect is subtle but corrosive. The victim begins to soften their language, preface their opinions, pause before speaking. Their thoughts feel heavier to carry, not because they've become less intelligent, but because they've absorbed the belief that they're slightly out of sync, slightly off track. Every time they share an idea and it's met with a smirk, a glazed-over nod, or a delayed reply, they feel smaller. The manipulator often positions themselves as the realist, the rational one, or the balanced voice, not by demonstrating superiority, but by carefully, consistently framing the victim's intellect as excessive, emotional, or disconnected. And over time, this framing works. The victim internalizes a leash. Speak, but not too boldly. Think, but not too differently. Know, but always with an apology. That's the damage of the intellectual downplay mirror. It doesn't silence genius. It muffles it. It trains brilliance to doubt itself, until eventually the mind that once lit up rooms now flickers quietly, hoping not to offend, not to stand out, not to seem like too much in a world that kept smiling while it slowly erased its reflection. Strategic withdrawal of self. Strategic withdrawal of self is the psychological trick of removing your presence, attention, or emotional availability at carefully chosen moments, not to leave, but to make the other person fear the loss of you. It's not abandonment, it's emotional scarcity used as currency, and its power lies in timing, not absence. At the start, the manipulator shows up fully. They give warmth, interest, laughter, shared dreams, deep talks. They make themselves feel indispensable. The victim begins to rely on their presence, not just for companionship, but for emotional regulation. And then, without warning, they pull away. A text goes unanswered, a conversation grows flat, affection dulls, and the silence isn't random, it's strategic. The withdrawal is just long enough to create panic, confusion, or self-blame. The victim replays interactions, wondering what they said wrong, how they pushed too far, or what flaw they revealed. And just when the fear peaks, the manipulator returns, smiling, unfazed, acting as if nothing happened. This intermittent vanishing act becomes a form of control. The victim begins to monitor their tone, mute their needs, and perform constantly, hoping to avoid the next disappearance. They work harder to keep the connection alive, even as they feel it slipping through their hands. And they internalize a lie. The manipulator is the stable one. I'm the problem. Over time, the manipulator's presence becomes a drug. Each return feels like relief, a second chance, a lifeline. But it isn't love, it's conditioning. The victim learns that emotional safety is not a given, it's a reward for compliance. And every time the manipulator withdraws, they leave behind a stronger tether until the victim fears not being rejected, but being forgotten, being erased by someone who once made them feel unforgettable. Expectation, collapse, ambush. Expectation, collapse, ambush is a psychological manipulation tactic where someone raises your hopes, builds anticipation, or promises emotional payoff, only to suddenly withdraw it, not for situational reasons, but to create a controlled emotional crash designed to leave you destabilized, grateful, or guilt-ridden. It starts with a rising rhythm. Plans are made, invitations extended, words of affirmation offered. The manipulator promises something they know matters: presence, affection, commitment, celebration. They watch your eyes light up. They see you emotionally invest. And then, at the peak of that anticipation, they pull the rug, not with cruelty, with reasons. I just didn't feel up to it. Something came up. You're overreacting. It's not a big deal. The letdown is made to seem small, reasonable, but the timing is too perfect. The energy drop too sharp. The impact too deep. Because it wasn't about the event. It was about the emotional withdrawal. The crash that follows isn't incidental. It's engineered. The victim, stunned by the reversal, doesn't just feel disappointed. They feel unworthy. They replay everything. Was I too excited? Too needy? Too expectant? They begin to question not just the situation, but themselves. And then comes the second wave, guilt. They don't want to seem ungrateful. They suppress their hurt. They offer understanding. They comfort the very person who let them fall. This is the trap. Over time, the victim becomes hesitant to hope. They learn to dim their joy preemptively, to not expect too much, to brace for the fall that always seems to follow the rise. And that's the goal: emotional compliance through learned caution. Because when someone fears their happiness will be used against them, they start asking for less, expecting less, wanting less. And the manipulator doesn't have to take control because they've already trained the heart not to reach. Favor guilt anchoring. Favor guilt anchoring is the psychological trick of doing seemingly generous things for someone, not out of kindness, but to create a lingering sense of debt so heavy that the victim begins adjusting their behavior to repay something that was never freely given. It's not help. It's a contract disguised as care. The manipulator doesn't demand gratitude immediately. They offer favors that feel thoughtful, even heroic. I stayed up all night helping you prepare. I dropped everything to be there. I covered that for you. Don't worry about it. The victim feels grateful, touched, but that's exactly what the manipulator wants, to anchor guilt into the core of the relationship. Later, the favor reappears, not as a demand, but as a shadow. When the victim expresses a need, discomfort, or even a boundary, the manipulator subtly invokes the past. I guess it's easy to forget everything I've done for you. Wow, I wouldn't have said no if you asked me. It's fine, I just thought we looked out for each other. These phrases are mild, but they pierce. The victim is hit with a wave of guilt, not because they did anything wrong, but because they're made to feel disloyal for not compensating properly. And so, they give in, they overextend, they say yes when they want to say no, not out of love, but out of emotional obligation. What makes favor guilt anchoring so insidious is that it corrupts the meaning of generosity. The victim starts questioning every act of kindness, wondering if it will come back to haunt them later, and eventually they stop asking for help altogether, because somewhere deep inside they've learned a hard truth. In this relationship, every gift is a leash. Every act of generosity comes with a debt they'll never be allowed to fully repay. Curiosity starvation tactic. The curiosity starvation tactic is a psychological manipulation strategy where a person withholds key information, emotional context, or clarity, not to protect, but to create a vacuum that keeps others constantly reaching, guessing, and emotionally tethered to the manipulator's unpredictable drip of truth. It doesn't begin with silence. It begins with almost saying something important, almost opening up, almost clarifying. They offer just enough to spark your interest, just enough to make you lean in, but never enough to let you settle. They drop vague hints. There's more to that story, but I don't want to get into it now. Or, you'd never believe what really happened. Or, if you knew everything, you'd see things differently. These statements aren't conversations. They're bait. And the victim bites. They ask follow-up questions. They probe gently. They wait, hoping the next conversation will fill the gaps. But it never does. The manipulator either deflects, changes the subject, or gives a cryptic half-answer that creates even more questions. Over time, this builds a psychological hunger. The victim doesn't just want information, they need it. Not because it's interesting, but because the withholding has created a mental itch they can't stop scratching. That's the trap. The manipulator becomes the only source of closure, of understanding, of truth, but they never deliver. They keep the victim emotionally invested by making them feel almost in the know, but always slightly outside the door. This hunger for insight turns into emotional dependence. Eventually, the victim finds themselves stuck in a cycle of overthinking, romanticizing, even defending the person who won't let them in. They start to believe the answers they crave are just one conversation away, but that conversation never comes because the power wasn't in the story, it was in the starvation. And when someone controls the flow of truth, they don't need to lie to manipulate. They just need to keep you waiting. Sudden absence programming. Sudden absence programming is the psychological trick of vanishing, abruptly, without warning or explanation, right after creating deep emotional intimacy, leaving the other person in a storm of confusion, longing, and self-doubt. It's not just disappearing, it's training the nervous system to crave instability. This tactic begins with intensity, frequent messages, long conversations, emotional vulnerability, shared secrets, flirtation, or even declarations of love. The manipulator floods the target with connection, so much so that the target begins to reorganize their emotional rhythm around this new bond. Their day, their thoughts, their sense of security all begin to revolve around presence. That's when the manipulator cuts it off. They vanish. No texts, no explanations, no goodbye, just silence. At first, the victim panics. What happened? Did I do something wrong? Are they okay? They replay everything. scanning for mistakes. They blame themselves, and then, just when the anxiety becomes unbearable, the manipulator returns, casual and composed. Sorry, just needed some space. You're overthinking. Let's not make this a big deal. But it is a big deal because something inside the victim has changed. The disappearance becomes a trauma loop. From then on, every moment of closeness comes with fear. They stop expressing needs. They become agreeable. They walk on emotional eggshells, terrified that even the smallest misstep will trigger another vanishing. And this is where the programming begins. The brain starts associating affection with loss, safety with unpredictability, love with fear. Over time, the victim doesn't just tolerate instability, they expect it. They chase the highs harder. They shrink during the lows. They hold tighter every time the manipulator returns, because now the threat isn't just rejection, it's erasure, a complete disappearance of something that once felt real, and the fear of that void becomes the chain that keeps them coming back. Reverse empathy mirror. The reverse empathy mirror is a dark psychological tactic where a manipulator flips the script of emotional validation, mirroring your pain not to connect with it, but to redirect the spotlight back onto themselves so your suffering becomes an accessory to theirs. It starts when you open up. You're vulnerable, raw, maybe even trembling with emotion, and just as you finish speaking, they say something like, "I know exactly how you feel. When that happened to me, it was even worse." Or, "I understand. That's like the time I was totally abandoned too." At first, it sounds like empathy, but it's not. It's a hijacking. Your pain has become a prompt. Your moment has been absorbed and reflected, twisted into their narrative. This isn't connection. It's emotional theft. The reverse empathy mirror turns every wound you reveal into a mirror they use to admire their own reflection. You end up comforting them in the middle of your breakdown. You watch your story become a backdrop to theirs. You start to feel guilty for bringing it up, for triggering their emotions, for not being more sensitive to their pain. Over time, this dynamic teaches you a dangerous lesson. Your feelings only matter if they can be used to serve someone else's. You begin to hesitate before opening up. You preface pain with disclaimers. You shrink your needs because you know eventually they'll be eclipsed. And the worst part? You may start to believe that's what empathy is. That's how the reverse empathy mirror traps you. It doesn't silence your pain. It reflects it just enough to make you think you've been heard before using it to build the manipulator's throne. And by the time you realize you've been emotionally inverted, you're already apologizing for your sadness, while the person who caused it is once again being comforted in your arms. Partial validation technique. Partial validation technique is the psychological trick of giving someone just enough approval to keep them emotionally invested, while subtly withholding full affirmation, so they're always striving, always unsure, and always needing to earn the next drop of approval. It's not about encouragement, it's about keeping someone hungry. The manipulator never fully denies the victim's worth. That would make resistance easy. Instead, they offer crumbs of praise. "That's better than usual. You're getting there. I mean, it's not bad." These phrases are designed to feel like progress, but not completion, like hope, but not certainty. The validation is partial, deliberately incomplete, so the target keeps chasing the full version that never comes. This creates a psychological loop. The victim works harder, performs better, shrinks their needs, and bends themselves in every direction, not because they are thriving, but because they're trying to prove they're enough. And every time they get close, the bar moves. The praise stays just out of reach, and the manipulator keeps control. Over time, this dynamic rewires the victim's relationship with success. Wins don't feel like wins. They feel like previews of approval that hasn't fully arrived. They stop trusting their own progress. They begin asking for feedback before forming opinions, apologizing for expressing pride, and deferring to the manipulator's judgment even when they feel confident inside. The brilliance of the partial validation technique is its subtlety. The manipulator appears supportive, even nurturing, but they always hold back just enough to keep the victim emotionally starving, enough to make them believe that if they just improve a little more, they'll finally be worthy of full praise. But the truth is, that finish line doesn't exist, because the game was never meant to end, it was only meant to control. Emotion leak technique. The emotion leak technique is a subtle psychological manipulation tactic where a person expresses controlled fragments of emotion, frustration, sadness, disappointment, just enough to shift the atmosphere and make others feel responsible, guilty, or obligated to fix something that's never fully named. It's not direct, it's not dramatic, it's the sigh after a conversation, the long pause before a response, the way their tone dips when you mention something you're excited about. They don't say what's wrong, they don't need to, they leak it. Just enough discomfort to make you feel it in your chest, just enough silence to make you question yourself. You start scanning the moment. Was I too harsh? Did I say something wrong? Are they upset with me? The manipulator never clarifies. They let the unease linger, letting it wrap around the room like fog. They might say, "It's nothing," or "Forget it," or even worse, "You wouldn't understand." That's the brilliance of it. They give you an emotion without the information, just enough to make you feel responsible, but never enough to allow resolution. Over time, this trains the victim to become hyper-attuned to every micro-expression, every pause, every subtle shift. They live in emotional anticipation, always adjusting themselves to prevent another leak. They apologize more, over-explain, try harder to smooth over invisible tension, not because they know what they did, but because they feel they must have done something wrong. This tactic creates a quiet kind of control. The manipulator doesn't have to demand, correct, or confront. They just have to feel slightly off, and the room bends to accommodate them. Because when someone uses emotional discomfort like a scent trail, others will follow it, not out of love, but out of the fear that they caused it. Unfinished sentence framing. Unfinished sentence framing is the psychological trick of intentionally leaving key thoughts incomplete, planting suggestive, emotionally loaded statements that force the other person to fill in the blanks with their own fears, guilt, or insecurities. It's not what's said that does the damage, it's what's almost said. This tactic plays on the human brain's need for closure. When someone begins a sentence with emotional weight, then trails off into silence, it triggers a subconscious scramble for meaning. The manipulator might say, "It's just never mind," or "I thought you'd be different, but," or "I was going to say something, but I don't want to hurt you." These fragments don't accuse directly. Instead, they suggest something terrible just beneath the surface. And that suggestion is more powerful than any statement could be, because now the victim is doing the manipulator's work for them, imagining the worst, questioning their own behavior, replaying everything they did or said. Did I fail them? Are they disgusted with me? What are they not saying? And in trying to solve the mystery, they grow anxious, self-critical, and emotionally unsteady. Over time, unfinished sentence framing becomes a form of psychological erosion. The victim begins to anticipate shame without it ever being voiced. They start over-explaining, apologizing, and second-guessing before conflict even happens, just to avoid the haunting silence that says, "You disappointed me, but I won't say how." What makes this tactic so destructive is its invisibility. The manipulator never has to own a single cruel word. They keep their hands clean while the victim drowns in imagined wrongdoing. And eventually, the silence becomes more powerful than speech, because it teaches the target that the most painful things are the ones that are almost said, but never finished. Expectation staircase trick. The expectation staircase trick is a manipulative psychological tactic where someone gradually increases what they expect from you, starting with small, reasonable requests and slowly escalating them until you find yourself doing things you never would have agreed to in the beginning, just to avoid conflict, guilt, or emotional fallout. It starts innocently. Can you help me with this real quick? Would you mind doing that favor? Just this once? You say yes. Of course you do. It's nothing. Then it happens again, but slightly more demanding, a little less optional, a little more emotionally charged. I really need you to handle this for me. No one else will. I can't believe you're hesitating. You used to be so helpful. Slowly, the baseline rises. You don't even notice the stairs being built beneath you, and by the time you look down, you've climbed far past your comfort zone. The trick works because it never jumps too far too fast. Each new request feels only slightly larger than the last, just enough to keep your conscience engaged, your sense of obligation activated. And if you resist, they pull out the early kindness. After everything I've done for you, I didn't expect you to be like this. Now you're not just failing a task, you're betraying an emotional agreement that was built on invisible scaffolding. Over time, you stop checking your boundaries. You just ask, what do they need next? You give more, stretch more, swallow more, and the manipulator, they keep climbing you like a staircase, step by step, until you're carrying their entire emotional weight and wondering how you became responsible for their comfort, survival, and mood. That's the cruelty of the expectation staircase. It makes obedience feel like growth, submission feel like love, and burnout feel like loyalty, until you forget that you ever had the right to say no. Wound reopening patterns. Wound reopening patterns is the psychological trick of repeatedly circling back to someone's old pain, not to heal it, but to keep it raw, ensuring the person stays emotionally weakened, easily influenced, and forever tethered to the manipulator's control. It's not about support. It's about strategic re-injury. This tactic begins with trust. The manipulator invites emotional disclosure, asks about past betrayals, traumas, insecurities, and heartbreaks. The victim opens up, believing they are being heard, seen, understood, and for a moment, they are. The listener nods, empathizes, maybe even sheds a tear, but this vulnerability isn't being held, it's being cataloged. Later, at carefully chosen moments, during conflict, silence, or negotiation, the manipulator resurrects the old wound, not violently, but surgically. You're doing that thing again, just like you did with your dad. I get it. You've always pushed people away when things get hard. It's not your fault. You've been broken for a long time. These phrases sound like insight, but they're weapons, because the wound wasn't reopened to understand. It was reopened to control, to make the victim small again, to remind them of their pain so that the manipulator can position themselves as the only one who gets it and the only one who will stay. The victim, suddenly flooded with past emotions, becomes destabilized in the present. They question themselves. They regress. They apologize not just for the moment, but for who they are. Over time, the victim starts to anticipate the pain before it arrives. They self-edit, self-silence, self-shrink, because they've learned any moment of disagreement, strength, or independence might provoke a reminder of who they were when they were most broken. And in that loop, healing becomes impossible, because every step forward is met with a knife made from the past, a wound never allowed to close, a scar endlessly reopened by the very hand that once claimed to care. Delayed blame loop. The delayed blame loop is a psychological manipulation tactic where blame isn't placed in the heat of the moment, but hours, days, or even weeks later, so the target is hit with unexpected guilt long after the event has passed, creating confusion, anxiety, and chronic emotional self-surveillance. It begins with silence. After an argument, a choice, or a simple misunderstanding, the manipulator doesn't react. They smile, they nod, they move on. Maybe they even say, "It's fine," or "Don't worry about it." You breathe,
thinking the moment passed. But it didn't. It was stored. And then, later, when your guard is down, they bring it back, not gently, not curiously, but with disappointment, resentment, accusation. I didn't want to ruin the mood earlier, but what you said really cut deep. I tried to let it go, but it's been eating at me. I can't believe you thought that was okay. Now you're caught off balance. The moment is foggy. You don't remember the exact details. You can't defend yourself clearly. And worse, you're blindsided by the emotional weight that's suddenly being thrown at you. You scramble to recall your tone, your words, your intent. You feel guilty, unsure, ashamed, and powerless. Because how do you fix something you barely remember doing? That's the loop. The manipulator avoids conflict when you have the emotional leverage. Then they circle back once they hold it. And because the timing is so unexpected, it rewires your behavior. You start to monitor every word in real time, afraid of what might be fine today and punishable next week. You live in a state of retroactive guilt, always preparing for emotional consequences that may or may not arrive. This tactic doesn't just make you feel guilty, it makes you feel haunted by past moments, forgotten expressions, neutral sentences that might suddenly become sins. And over time, you learn not to relax, not to speak freely, not to trust peace, because in the delayed blame loop, nothing is ever over. It's just waiting. Rejection, echo planting, is the psychological trick of subtly embedding the idea that others have already rejected you or soon will, causing you to pre-reject yourself in conversations, relationships, or decisions before reality ever has the chance to speak. It's not about saying you're not wanted, it's about making rejection feel inevitable. This tactic starts with offhand comments, backhanded observations, or false assumptions disguised as insight. They probably think you're too much. I mean, people talk, you know. I'm just trying to protect you. This always happens. These words are never screamed. They're dropped quietly, like poison in water. The manipulator doesn't frame it as their opinion. They frame it as a reflection of what others already believe. And that's the hook, because the moment the victim believes they are being silently rejected by others, by friends, partners, family, employers, they begin to shrink themselves in advance. They tone down their voice. They second-guess their emotions. They pull back before closeness, success, or joy can take root. Not because of actual rejection, but because they've been programmed to expect it. Over time, these echoes become internalized. The victim doesn't need the manipulator to say it anymore. They say it to themselves. They're not going to like this. I shouldn't speak up. It's probably too late for me anyway. The manipulator's job is done. They've built an echo chamber where rejection never has to happen externally because the person rejects themselves before anyone else can. And the cruel brilliance of rejection echo planting is that it isolates. The victim stops seeking reassurance, stops believing support is real, and starts confusing silence with judgment. They walk into every room feeling already unwelcome, haunted by whispers that no one else hears because those whispers were planted there, carefully, quietly, permanently. Mimicry with malice is a psychological manipulation technique where a person imitates your tone, gestures, language, or emotional expressions, not to build rapport, but to mock, belittle, or destabilize your sense of self-worth through subtle humiliation disguised as imitation. At first, it can seem like a joke, a smirk, while copying the way you speak, an exaggerated version of how you gesture, a mimic of your emotional tone, repeated just slightly too loud, too slow, or too dramatic. Oh, really? They echo with that sharp edge of sarcasm, mimicking your sincerity like a costume they find amusing. They laugh, shrug it off. Relax, I'm just teasing. But it doesn't feel like teasing. It feels like exposure. This isn't the warmth of mirroring used to build connection. It's a calculated distortion. The manipulator uses your own mannerisms as weapons, holding them up like cracked mirrors. You start to feel self-conscious in your own body. You question your tone, your expressions, your reactions. Every gesture becomes a risk of being replayed in mockery later. You stop being spontaneous. You start editing yourself in real time. Over time, this tactic trains you into smallness. You laugh less freely, speak with less confidence, dull your authenticity, because when the core of who you are, your quirks, your tone, your natural way of expressing is repeatedly turned into a joke, you begin to associate self-expression with shame. And the manipulator, they hide behind humor. It's not that deep. You're too sensitive, but it is that deep, because mimicry with malice doesn't just mock the surface, it chips away at the identity beneath it until the victim learns that the safest version of themselves is the quietest one. Spiritual bypass projection. Spiritual bypass projection is the psychological trick of using spiritual language, ideals, or practices to shame someone out of their pain, invalidate their instincts, and mask manipulation as enlightenment. It's not about healing, it's about control wrapped in holiness. This tactic doesn't scream, it flows. It sounds wise, elevated, unshakably calm. When the victim expresses anger, fear, grief, or boundaries, the manipulator responds not with empathy, but with dismissal cloaked in virtue. You're still holding on to ego. That's not very high vibration of you. Real healing means letting that go. These phrases sound like guidance, but they hit like erasure. The victim's raw humanity is treated as a flaw to be transcended, not a reality to be respected. And that's the hook, because the victim wants to grow. They want to be self-aware, compassionate, grounded. So, when their very real trauma response is labeled as attachment or their boundary is rebranded as resistance, they begin to doubt themselves. They swallow pain instead of expressing it. They confuse silence with maturity. They call their own voice ego and the manipulator's voice truth. Over time, the victim becomes spiritually mute. They suppress anger under the guise of peace. They ignore red flags in the name of surrender. They self-abandon, all while congratulating themselves for letting go. But they're not letting go. They're being shamed out of their humanity by someone who weaponizes enlightenment. The manipulator, meanwhile, remains above it all, never raising their voice, never getting pulled into the low vibration emotions they provoke. They appear calm because they're in control. The chaos they cause doesn't touch them. It only silences the one who's hurting. And the result? A person who thinks their suffering means spiritual failure, who believes healing means submission, and who prays for peace while quietly bleeding in the name of alignment. Insecurity inflation trap. The insecurity inflation trap is a psychological manipulation tactic where small doubts and flaws, real or imagined, are carefully spotlighted, expanded, and echoed back until they feel massive, unbearable, and identity-defining to the person being targeted. It doesn't start with insults. It starts with observations. You get overwhelmed easily, don't you? You've always been kind of anxious in crowds. I know you're not really the confident type. These comments sound casual, almost compassionate, but they name something fragile, something the victim may already quietly fear. Then they say it again, and again, and again. What was once a passing worry becomes a label, a personality trait, a barrier. The manipulator makes it a part of the narrative. You wouldn't enjoy that, you don't handle stress well, or that's too much pressure for someone like you. And the victim, hearing this reflection over and over, begins to accept it. They stop questioning if it's true. They just start living as if it is. That's how the trap works. The more the insecurity is inflated, the more power the manipulator gains, because now the victim is boxed in by a version of themselves they didn't fully agree to, but feel too small to challenge. They start opting out of opportunities, staying silent, turning down joy, not because they lack ability, but because they've been conditioned to believe that they are the problem. Over time, this creates a feedback loop of self-limitation. The victim performs their insecurity, which reinforces it, which deepens the belief. And the manipulator, they never had to control through force. They just had to name the bruise, press on it, watch it swell, and convince the person it's who they've always been. Mind fog induction. Mind fog induction is the psychological trick of deliberately overwhelming, distracting, or subtly confusing someone until they begin to doubt their own thoughts, forget their original intentions, and lose their ability to think clearly in the presence of the manipulator. It's not about shouting or lying. It's about clouding cognition until control feels like clarity. This tactic unfolds like smoke, slow, invisible, and suffocating. The manipulator floods conversations with contradictions, tangents, vague answers, or endless context that spins around the issue without ever addressing it. They may change topics mid-sentence, over-explain simple ideas, or pepper statements with enough subtle distortions that the victim feels the need to constantly reorient themselves. That's not what I meant, but also, you misunderstood it. You're overreacting, but yes, it did happen, but not like that. Over time, the victim begins to feel mentally unstable, exhausted from trying to track shifting truths, emotionally drained from constantly recalibrating reality. The manipulator's presence becomes a place where thoughts don't stick, logic slides, and memory becomes foggy. The victim starts apologizing just to end the conversation. They retreat inward, not out of shyness, but because their mind is no longer safe in dialogue. And here's where the trick tightens. The manipulator offers themselves as the solution. I know it's a lot. I'm the only one who understands. Just let me explain. It's too complicated for most people. They create confusion and then brand themselves as the clearest voice inside it. This generates dependence. The victim, lost in the fog, starts relying on the one who created it. Mind fog induction doesn't silence by force. It silences by fatigue. It doesn't imprison with walls. It erodes the compass. And eventually, the victim stops arguing, stops thinking, and begins asking for directions from the very hand that spun the mist around their mind. Semantic overload trap. The semantic overload trap is a psychological manipulation technique where a person floods conversations with abstract language, technical jargon, or emotionally loaded phrases, creating confusion, imbalance, and self-doubt so that the victim defers not because they agree, but because they no longer understand what's being said. It doesn't sound like manipulation. It sounds intelligent, sophisticated, enlightened. The manipulator talks in circles that feel too dense to interrupt. They use complex metaphors, philosophical tangents, over-explain logic, or pseudo-therapeutic language that wraps around itself until the original point is lost. It's not that I'm avoiding the issue, it's that the issue itself is a construct rooted in emotional projection. You're reacting from a trauma-informed lens that distorts the present moment. What does that even mean? You're not sure, but somehow you feel like the one who's wrong, and that's the point. The semantic overload trap isn't meant to clarify, it's meant to destabilize. It's a flood of language that drowns your instinct. It forces you to second-guess your gut and question your grasp of reality. You start thinking, maybe I just don't get it. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe they're operating on a level I'm not equipped for. The conversation becomes an arena of performance where the manipulator wins by sounding too complex to challenge. Eventually, you stop pushing back, not because you've been convinced, but because you've been disoriented. The manipulator's command of language becomes a smokescreen, and behind it, they build a throne. You become quiet, cautious, unsure. They become the authority, not because they have the truth, but because they've made it feel like truth is too complicated for you to hold. That's the cruelty of the semantic overload trap. It doesn't silence your voice with fear. It silences it with fog, until the easiest path forward is surrender, not to reason, but to the illusion of it. Denial of perception. Denial of perception is the psychological trick of rejecting someone's direct experience of reality, not with evidence, but with conviction, until they begin to question not just what they saw or heard, but whether their senses and intuition can ever be trusted again. It's not about proving someone wrong. It's about erasing the reliability of their own mind. This tactic often looks calm, reasonable, even loving. The manipulator doesn't shout, "You're crazy." They gently say, "I don't think that happened the way you remember. You always take things the wrong way. You're being too sensitive. It wasn't like that." They offer alternative versions of events not grounded in fact, but in subtle authority, and they say it with such certainty the victim begins to falter. The first time, the target might resist. "No, I remember what you said." But when the denial is repeated enough, with just the right tone of disappointment or confusion, the victim starts to rewrite their memory. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I overreacted. They begin to doubt the one thing no one should have to, their own perception. Over time, this destabilizes their inner compass. They start deferring to the manipulator for clarity, checking in before trusting their feelings, waiting for external validation before reacting. This dependency grows until they stop voicing concerns altogether. Why speak up if it will only be denied? Why trust your senses if they keep betraying you? And that's the genius of denial of perception. It doesn't just shift the narrative. It hijacks the lens through which all narratives are formed. The manipulator doesn't have to control every moment. They just have to control the person's trust in their own eyes, their own ears, their own gut. Once that is gone, the victim doesn't just lose arguments, they lose reality.